I walk along a river in the quiet hours, when mist still clings to the water, and the world feels like something painted long ago on silk. The river is the Yellow River, winding through a landscape of less plateaus and ancient valleys, and I am imagining a time thousands of years distant when this same water flowed past settlements of earth and timber, when people first gathered along these banks and began to shape a civilization that would endure for millennia. The air is cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant mountains, and in my mind I see the land as it might have been in those earliest days, before the great dynasties, before the emperors and the scholars, when communities lived in semi-subterranean dwellings carved into the yellow earth, their roofs thatched with millet stalks, smoke rising from cooking fires into a sky that seemed infinite. There is something profound in tracing the thread of a culture back to its origins, to the Neolithic villages where pottery first emerged with distinctive markings, where jade was carved into forms both practical and sacred, where the rhythm of planting and harvest became the heartbeat of human existence. The Yellow River runs thick with sediment, earning its name from the color of the loess soil it carries from the highlands, and this very soil became the foundation of agriculture in northern China, fertile and workable, yielding millet and later wheat, sustaining populations that grew and clustered into larger settlements. I picture the villages of the Yangshao culture scattered across the central plains between 5,000 and 3,000 years before the Common Era. Their painted pottery decorated with geometric patterns and stylized fish, their dead buried with care and ceremony, evidence of a people who contemplated meaning and continuity. The Longshan culture followed, known for its thin black pottery, burnished to a lustrous sheen, vessels so delicate they seem almost impossible, crafted without the wheel, shaped by hand and tool into forms of extraordinary refinement. These were not isolated communities, but networks of influence and exchange, ideas traveling along waterways and across plains, techniques shared and adapted, the slow accumulation of knowledge that would eventually crystallize into something recognizable as Chinese civilization in the valleys of the Yellow River and the Yangtze, in the Central Plain and beyond. People were developing agriculture, domesticating animals, creating increasingly complex social structures, and somewhere in this gradual transformation, the seeds of written language were being planted. Oracle bones would come later, but even in these early periods, there were symbols, marks on pottery, signs that human beings were reaching toward a way to record and transmit what they knew, to speak across time. The landscape, I imagine, is one of cycles, the river flooding and receding, seasons turning with dependable regularity, and within this natural rhythm, human culture finding its own patterns, its own expressions of order and beauty. The mist on the river thickened slightly, and I think of how water itself became a symbol in Chinese thought, its fluidity and persistence, its capacity to shape stone through patient repetition, the way it seeks the lowest places and yet sustains all life. There is a particular quality to this imagining, a sense of deep time, of centuries layering upon centuries, each generation adding its contribution to a cultural foundation that would support towering achievements in philosophy, art, governance, technology. The villages grow larger in my mind's eye, evolving into walled settlements, social hierarchies emerging, specialized craftspeople, early forms of administration, the apparatus of what would become dynastic rule taking shape incrementally, organically, and always the river flowing through it all, witness to every change and continuity, carrying soil from the mountains to the plains, sustaining the crops that fed the people who built this civilization, grain by grain, idea by idea. The air grows quieter still, and I feel myself standing at the threshold of a vast historical landscape, ready to walk further into the depths of ancient China, to trace the development of one of humanity's great cultural achievements, to understand how wisdom and artistry and innovation emerged from these yellow river valleys and spread their influence across millennia. The transition from scattered settlements to something more unified began in the mists of the second millennium before the Common Era, when bronze working appeared in the Yellow River Valley, transforming both warfare and ritual, creating objects of power and beauty that spoke of centralized authority and sophisticated craft. The Shang dynasty emerges from this period, the first Chinese dynasty confirmed by both archaeological evidence and written records, ruling from approximately 1600 to 1046 before the Common Era, their capital cities shifting over the centuries, but their cultural influence radiating outward with increasing force. At Anyang, the last Shang capital, archaeologists have uncovered the foundations of massive earth platforms that once supported palace structures, royal tombs filled with extraordinary treasures, and pits containing thousands of oracle bones, the earliest substantial body of Chinese writing. These oracle bones are pieces of turtle to plastron and ox scapula, carefully prepared, then inscribed with questions posed to the ancestors and the spirits, inquiries about harvests and warfare, childbirth and illness, the king seeking guidance from the realm beyond the visible. Heat was applied to the bone, creating cracks, and diviners interpreted these fissures as answers from the spiritual world. The questions and sometimes the outcomes were carved into the bone itself, creating an archive of royal concerns, of ritual practice, of a written language already remarkably developed. The script on these bones contains thousands of distinct characters, many recognizable as ancestors of modern Chinese writing, revealing a system that was not in its infancy but already mature, sophisticated, capable of expressing complex ideas and recording detailed information. The Shang kings ruled through a combination of military might and ritual authority. They were intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds, responsible for maintaining cosmic harmony through elaborate ceremonies and sacrifices. Bronze vessels cast specifically for ancestral offerings. These bronze vessels are among the most stunning achievements of Shang civilization, created through piece mold casting, a technique requiring extraordinary precision. Molten bronze poured into ceramic molds, assembled from multiple sections, producing vessels with intricate surface designs. Taotia masks with their mysterious staring eyes, dragons and other creatures, both real and imagined. The weight of a large Shang bronze is considerable, the metal itself precious. Requiring copper and tin in careful proportion, the resources and labor needed to produce such objects indicating wealth, power, the ability to command both materials and skilled workers. In the royal tombs at Anyang, these bronzes were buried alongside jade, weapons, chariots, and sacrificial victims, creating an afterlife retinue for the deceased king. The tombs themselves, vast underground chambers approached by sloping ramps, evidence of massive communal labor and social stratification. The Shang world was one of cities and surrounding territories, of agriculture supporting specialized craftspeople, of trade networks bringing in resources from distant regions, cowrie shells from southern seas used as currency, turtle shells from the south for divination, jade from far western sources. But beyond the Shang heartland, other cultures and peoples existed, some in tributary relationships, others independent, and among these were the Zhou, initially a frontier people to the west, gradually growing in strength and sophistication. The Zhou would eventually challenge Shang authority, and around 1046 before the Common Era, at the Battle of Muye, the Zhou forces defeated the last Shang king, establishing a new dynasty that would prove to be the longest in Chinese history, though its effective power would wax and wane over the centuries. The Zhou justified their conquest through a revolutionary concept, the mandate of heaven, the idea that the right to rule came from heaven itself, granted to the virtuous and withdrawn from the corrupt, a justification for rebellion that would echo through Chinese political philosophy for thousands of years. Under this mandate, the Zhou kings presented themselves as sons of heaven, ruling through moral authority as much as military force. But the practical reality of governing a large territory led them to establish a feudal system, granting lands to relatives and loyal supporters, creating a network of vassal states owing allegiance to the Zhou king. The Western Zhou period, from approximately 1046 to 771 before the Common Era, saw the Zhou capital established near modern Xi'an, ritual and governance continuing many Shang traditions while introducing new elements, bronze inscriptions growing longer and more detailed, recording grants of land, military campaigns, ritual performances. These inscriptions provide historians with invaluable information, names and dates, relationships and events, the concerns and achievements of the nobility, the expansion of literacy beyond the court diviners to a broader administrative class. But the feudal system contained the seeds of fragmentation as vassal states grew powerful in their own right, as distances and local interests created diverging loyalties, and in 771 before the Common Era, the Zhou were forced to move their capital eastward to Luoyang after an invasion and the death of the king, marking the beginning of the Eastern Zhou period. The Eastern Zhou is traditionally divided into two phases, the spring and autumn period, from 771 to 476 before the Common Era, and the Warring States period, from 475 to 221 before the Common Era, a time of political fragmentation and intense cultural flowering. During the spring and autumn period, the Zhou king retained nominal authority, but real power lay with the feudal lords, who increasingly acted as independent rulers, engaging in complex diplomacy and frequent warfare, forming alliances and breaking them, competing for territory and resources. This was an era of transformation, iron tools appearing and gradually replacing bronze for agricultural implements and weapons, increasing agricultural productivity, supporting larger populations, enabling the expansion of cultivated land. Cities grew in size and sophistication, walls of rammed Earth, protecting populations that might number in the tens of thousands, markets and workshops, districts for different crafts, neighborhoods for various social classes. And it was during this period of political chaos and social change that Chinese philosophical thought experienced its most creative efflorescence, later called the 100 Schools of Thought, a profusion of ideas about governance, ethics, human nature, the cosmos. Confucius lived during the late spring and autumn period, born in 551 before the Common Era in the state of Lu, experiencing firsthand the disorder of his time, the decline of ritual propriety, the breakdown of traditional hierarchies. His response was to look backward to the early Zhou, which he idealized as a time of virtue and proper governance, and to advocate for a return to ritual, to ethical behavior based on humaneness and reciprocity, to a social order in which everyone knew and fulfilled their role. Confucius was not a religious prophet, but a teacher, gathering students who recorded his sayings, which would eventually be compiled into the Analects. Conversations and brief observations, emphasizing learning, self-cultivation, the importance of the past as a guide for the present. His influence during his lifetime was limited. He served briefly in government, but spent most of his later years teaching, traveling from state to state, seeking a ruler who would implement his vision, never fully succeeding, yet planting seeds that would grow into one of the world's great philosophical traditions. Around the same time, other thinkers were developing radically different visions. Laozi, if he existed as a single historical figure, associated with the Tao Te Ching, a text advocating withdrawal from conventional society, alignment with the Tao, the way, the underlying pattern of the cosmos, achieved through non-action simplicity, yielding rather than striving. The Tao Te Ching speaks in paradoxes and poetry, suggesting that true knowledge comes from unlearning, that strength lies in flexibility, that the best government is one that governs least, allowing people to live naturally without excessive intervention or artificial constructs. Mozi, founder of Mohism, preached universal love and condemned wasteful ritual and aggressive warfare, arguing for a pragmatic utilitarianism, actions judged by their benefit to society as a whole, a meritocracy in which the capable governed regardless of birth. These competing visions, Confucian emphasis on ritual and hierarchy, Taoist celebration of naturalness and spontaneity, Mohist focus on utility and universal concern, created a rich intellectual marketplace, ideas tested through debate and writing, schools forming around charismatic teachers. The Warring States period intensified both the conflict and the creativity. The feudal states, now essentially independent kingdoms, engaging in total war, mobilizing entire populations, developing new military technologies and strategies. 7 major states dominated this period: Qi and Chu, Yan and Han, Zhao and Wei, and Qin, each controlling substantial territories, each developing distinct administrative systems and cultural characteristics, yet all still recognizably part of a shared Chinese civilization. Iron weapons and tools became standard. Crossbows appeared, giving infantry new power against aristocratic chariot warriors. Armies grew to hundreds of thousands, campaigns lasting months or years, the scale of violence unprecedented. Yet this same period saw the construction of massive irrigation projects, the codification of laws, the expansion of trade, Cities like Linsi in Qi, housing populations that may have exceeded 200,000, cosmopolitan centers attracting merchants and scholars from across the known world. The philosophers of this era grappled with urgent questions: how to create order from chaos, how to strengthen the state against its rivals, how to live ethically in violent times, and their answers shaped Chinese thought for millennia. Mencius, a Confucian thinker of the 4th century before the Common Era, argued that human nature was fundamentally good, that everyone possessed innate moral sense, that government should nurture this goodness through education and benevolent policies, that a ruler who failed his people lost the mandate of heaven. Sunzi, another Confucian, took the opposite view, arguing that human nature was fundamentally selfish, that only through education, ritual, and strict social norms could people be shaped into ethical beings. That order required active cultivation, not just release of natural goodness. The legalist school emerged, advocating for strict laws uniformly applied, for a powerful state apparatus, for rewards and punishments as the primary tools of governance, rejecting moral suasion in favor of institutional control, a philosophy that would prove attractive to rulers seeking to consolidate power. Among the warring states, Qin in the West had long been considered semi-barbarous, a frontier region, but it embraced legalist principles with ruthless efficiency, implementing reforms that transformed it into a military and administrative powerhouse. Shang Yang, a legalist reformer in the 4th century before the Common Era, restructured Qin society from the ground up, abolishing the old aristocracy, creating a meritocracy based on military achievement, dividing the population into mutual responsibility groups, standardizing measurements, registering households for taxation and conscription. These reforms were harsh, punishments severe, but they created a state apparatus of unprecedented effectiveness. Agricultural production increased. The army became disciplined and motivated. Resources flowed to the central government, and Qin began its inexorable expansion. By 230 before the Common Era, Qin had conquered or absorbed all the other major states, and in 221, the Qin king proclaimed himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin, ruler of a unified Chinese empire, a political achievement that would define the region for over 2 millennia. The first emperor was a figure of immense ambition and energy. He standardized weights and measures across the empire, unified the written script, ensuring that despite differences in spoken language, educated people throughout China could communicate through a common written form, a decision with profound long-term consequences. He standardized currency, the wheel gauge of carts, so they would fit the same ruts in roads, creating an infrastructure of uniformity that facilitated trade and administration. He built roads radiating from the capital, connecting distant provinces, enabling rapid communication and troop movement. The Great Wall, though not built entirely by the first emperor, took its most ambitious form under his reign, connecting and extending earlier defensive walls, built by various states, creating a massive barrier against nomadic incursions from the north, a project requiring hundreds of thousands of laborers, many of whom died in the harsh conditions. This wall was not the stone structure visible today. That would come much later during the Ming dynasty, but rather rammed earth and wood, following mountain ridges and river valleys, stretching thousands of li across northern China, a statement of imperial power and paranoia. The first emperor's palace complex at Xianyang was said to be vast, though little remains, and he began construction of his tomb, a project that would continue throughout his reign and beyond, creating an underground palace guarded by thousands of terracotta warriors, each individually crafted, each with distinct features, an army for the afterlife. These terracotta soldiers stand in formation, life-sized warriors and officers, archers and cavalry, accompanied by horses and chariots, originally painted in bright colors, now mostly faded to bare clay. Their discovery in the 1970s revealing the scale of the first emperor's megalomania and the extraordinary skill of Qin craftspeople. But the first emperor's reign was also marked by intellectual repression in 213 before the Common Era. He ordered the burning of books, particularly historical records and philosophical texts, seeking to eliminate alternative visions of governance and history to make his reign appear as the beginning of time itself, the culmination of civilization, rather than one phase in a long development. Confucian scholars, it was said, were buried alive for resisting these measures, though the historical accuracy of this claim is debated. What is certain is that the first emperor sought to control thought as thoroughly as he controlled territory, to impose unity of mind as well as political unity. His death in 210 before the Common Era came during a tour of the eastern provinces, his body transported back to the capital in secret, his chief eunuch and chief minister maneuvering to place a pliable son on the throne. But the regime they had built through fear and force could not long survive its creator. Rebellions erupted, sparked by conscripted laborers and disaffected peasants, spreading rapidly across the empire. And within 4 years of the first emperor's death, the Qin dynasty had collapsed, replaced by civil war, various factions competing for control of the empire that the first emperor had so recently unified. From this chaos emerged Liu Bang, a man of common birth, a minor official turned rebel leader, who outmaneuvered his more aristocratic rival, Xiang Yu, through a combination of a strategic patience, political flexibility, and willingness to delegate to capable subordinaries. In 206 before the Common Era, Liu Bang proclaimed the Han dynasty, taking the imperial title as Emperor Gaozu, establishing a capital at Chang'an, near the old Zhou capital, and setting about creating a more sustainable form of imperial rule than the harsh legalism of Qin. The Han dynasty would last, with one interruption, for over 400 years, from 206 before the Common Era to 220 of the Common Era, divided into the Western Han and Eastern Han periods, becoming the classical age of Chinese civilization, the period when many distinctive features of Chinese culture crystallized into enduring forms. Early Han emperors retained much of the Qin administrative structure, the system of provinces and counties, appointed officials rather than hereditary nobility, but they softened the harsh legalist edges, reduced taxes, relaxed punishments, and increasingly drew on Confucian ideology to legitimate their rule. Emperor Wu, who reigned from 141 to 87 before the Common Era, presided over the greatest expansion of Han power, his armies pushing into Central Asia, establishing the Silk Road trade routes, conquering territories in the south, in Korea, in Vietnam, creating an empire that rivaled Rome in size and sophistication, Under Emperor Wu, Confucianism became the official state ideology. Examinations based on Confucian classics became the path to government service, creating a bureaucracy of educated men, the scholar officials who would administer China for centuries, their authority based on learning rather than birth or military prowess. This marriage of Confucian ethics and imperial bureaucracy proved remarkably durable. The classics became the foundation of education, memorized and interpreted, providing a common cultural reference, a shared vocabulary of governance and morality, and the examination system, though it would evolve considerably over time, created at least the possibility of social mobility through education. The Han capital, Chang'an, grew into one of the world's great cities. Perhaps 250,000 people within its walls, palaces and markets, workshops and warehouses. The Imperial University training thousands of students in the Confucian classics, preparing them for government service. Beyond the capital, provincial cities thrived, connected by roads and canals, trade flowing along these arteries, silk and lacquerware, iron tools and salt, grain and timber, a monetized economy reaching even rural villages, bronze coins strung on cords, standardized and ubiquitous. The Silk Road opened during the Han period, routes running west from China through Central Asia, connecting to Persia and eventually to Rome, carrying silk and spices, precious metals and glassware, but also ideas and technologies. Buddhism traveling east, Chinese inventions traveling west. Papermaking was invented during the Han, traditionally attributed to Kai Lun in the year 105 of the Common Era, though recent archaeological discoveries suggest paper may have existed in cruder forms earlier. This new material gradually replacing bamboo strips and silk as a writing surface, cheaper and more practical, enabling the spread of literacy and record keeping. Han artisans produced extraordinary works, silk textiles of breathtaking delicacy, lacquerware with dozens of layers polished to a deep luster, bronze mirrors decorated with intricate patterns, jade suits intended to preserve bodies in death, each piece sewn together with gold or silver thread, thousands of jade plaques precisely shaped and fitted. Han tombs, particularly those of the wealthy, were filled with minqi, spirit goods, ceramic models of houses and farms, granaries and pigsties, servants and entertainers, creating a complete miniature world for the afterlife. These objects now provide historians with invaluable evidence about daily life, architecture, technology, social structures. The tomb of Lady Dai at Mawangdui, sealed in the 2nd century before the Common Era and excavated in the 1970s, contained her remarkably preserved body, silk garments and banners, lacquerware and food offerings, and texts, medical treatises, and philosophical works. Versions of the Tao Te Ching older than any previously known, expanding our understanding of early Taoism. Historians during the Han period established patterns that would guide Chinese historiography for millennia. Sima Qian, writing in the late 2nd and early 1st centuries before the Common Era, created the Shiji, Records of the Grand Historian, a comprehensive history from mythical origins to his own time. Over 500,000 characters, biographies and chronologies, treatises on economics and ritual, astronomy and water management. Sima Qian suffered castration as punishment for defending a disgraced general, a humiliation that nearly drove him to suicide, but he persevered to complete his father's historical project, creating a work of extraordinary scope and literary power, establishing the biographical approach to history that would characterize later Chinese historical writing. The later Han, or Eastern Han period, began in 25 of the Common Era after a brief interregnum when the Wang Mang usurpation disrupted the dynasty. The capital moved east to Luoyang, and the empire reconsolidated, though with increasing power held by great families rather than the central government. Buddhism entered China during this period, traveling along the Silk Road from India and Central Asia, initially seeming strange and foreign. Monasticism and vegetarianism, the concept of reincarnation, all quite different from native Chinese traditions, but gradually being adapted and Sinicized, translated into concepts drawn from Taoism, attracting imperial patronage. The first Buddhist temples were built, sutras translated into Chinese, often with considerable creativity, matching Sanskrit terms to Chinese philosophical vocabulary, creating a hybrid tradition that would eventually become distinctively Chinese. Chan Buddhism, Pure Land, traditions that would later spread to Korea and Japan. Meanwhile, Taoism itself was evolving from a philosophical tradition into an organized religion, with priesthoods and rituals, sacred mountains and pilgrimage sites, techniques for achieving immortality through meditation, alchemy, dietary practices, sexual techniques, creating a rich tradition of esoteric knowledge and practice. The Yellow Turban Rebellion in 184 of the Common Era, led by a Taoist religious movement, marked the beginning of the end for the Han Dynasty. Widespread discontent with corruption and inequality, exacerbated by natural disasters, erupting into massive revolt, though the rebellion was suppressed. The dynasty never fully recovered its authority. Power devolved to regional warlords, generals commanding personal armies, and in 220, the last Han emperor abdicated, ending over 400 years of Han rule. China fragmenting into the Three Kingdoms period, a time of warfare and instability, but also of cultural vitality, of stories and legends that would inspire literature and art for centuries. The period following the collapse of the Han is known as the Age of Division, nearly 4 centuries of fragmentation from 220 to 589 of the Common Era, when no single dynasty controlled all of China, when the North and South developed along increasingly different trajectories, yet when culture and thought continued to evolve and deepen. The Three Kingdoms period, romanticized in later literature, saw the empire divided among Wei in the north, Shu in the southwest, and Wu in the southeast. Warlords and strategists engaged in elaborate campaigns, alliances shifting, battles celebrated in epic tales that blur history and legend. The romance of the Three Kingdoms, written over a millennium later, would immortalize figures like the cunning strategist Zhuge Liang, the loyal warrior Guan Yu, the ambitious general Cao Cao, creating archetypal characters whose stories became embedded in Chinese popular culture, performed in operas, painted on temple walls, referenced in everyday conversation. But the historical reality was one of devastation, populations declining from warfare and displacement, agricultural land abandoned, cities depopulated, and eventually even the Three Kingdoms proved unstable. Brief reunification under the Jin dynasty, then collapse into further division when nomadic peoples from the north invaded and established their own dynasties on Chinese soil. The north came under the control of non-Chinese rulers, Xianbei, Xiongnu, and other steppe peoples who adopted Chinese administrative practices and cultural forms while maintaining elements of their own traditions, creating hybrid cultures, sponsoring Buddhism as a unifying ideology that transcended ethnic boundaries. The South remained under ethnic Chinese dynasties, a succession of short-lived regimes based in Jiangkang, modern Nanjing, where aristocratic families dominated politics, where Taoist philosophy flourished, where poetry became increasingly sophisticated, where landscape painting emerged as a distinctive art form. This was the period when the scholar recluse became a cultural ideal, educated men withdrawing from politics to pursue spiritual cultivation, composing poetry in mountain retreats, discussing metaphysics while drinking wine, the seven sages of the bamboo grove epitomizing this aesthetic of elegant withdrawal. Tao Yuanming, also called Tao Qian, poet of the late 4th and early 5th centuries, left government service to return to farming, writing verses celebrating the simple pleasures of rural life, chrysanthemums blooming by his fence, wine in earthenware cups, freedom from the corruption and constraint of official life, his poetry becoming a touchstone for later generations seeking authenticity and natural simplicity. Buddhism, meanwhile, grew from a foreign curiosity into a major cultural force, monasteries accumulating wealth and land, becoming centers of learning and art, cave temples carved into cliff faces at sites like Dunhuang and Yungang, walls covered with painted Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, storytelling through image and color. The Yungang grottos, begun in the 5th century under the Northern Wei dynasty, contain enormous stone Buddhas, some over 50 feet tall, carved directly from the sandstone cliff, their faces serene, their robes flowing in elegant folds, synthesis of Indian Buddhist iconography and Chinese sculptural traditions. Monks traveled to India to study at the source, bringing back texts and teachings. Faxian in the early 5th century, Huanzang in the 7th century, their journeys arduous and dangerous, crossing deserts and mountains, years spent in study before returning with precious manuscripts and relics, their travel accounts providing valuable historical evidence about Central Asia and South Asia. Buddhist philosophy engaged Chinese intellectuals. The concept of emptiness, the nature of consciousness, debates between different schools, Tiantai, Huayan, each developing elaborate metaphysical systems, integrating Buddhist ideas with indigenous Chinese thought, creating something new from the synthesis. The Sui dynasty, 581 to 618 of the Common Era, finally reunified North and South after nearly 4 centuries of division. Emperor Wen and his son, Emperor Yang, undertaking massive projects, the Grand Canal, linking the Yellow River and Yangtze River systems over 1,000 miles of waterway, enabling grain transport from the fertile south to the political center in the north. The Grand Canal required immense labor, millions of workers conscripted, many dying in the effort, but it created an infrastructure that would serve China for over a millennium. Water flowing through locks and across aqueducts, barges carrying rice and silk, salt and timber, binding the empire together through hydraulic engineering. But the Sui, like the Qin before them, exhausted their resources through over-ambition, costly military campaigns in Korea, massive construction projects, rebellions erupting, and the dynasty collapsed after less than 40 years, replaced by the Tang. The Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 of the Common Era, is often considered the golden age of Chinese civilization, a period of military strength, economic prosperity, cultural brilliance, and cosmopolitan openness, the capital Chang'an becoming the world's largest city, over 1 million residents within the walls, another million in the surrounding area. Chang'an was laid out in a grid pattern, broad avenues running north-south and east-west, walled wards containing residences and shops, markets designated for Eastern and Western trade, foreigners from across Asia, Persians and Arabs, Sogdians and Koreans, Japanese monks and Tibetan emissaries, a truly international metropolis. The Tang legal code, completed in the early 7th century, synthesized centuries of legal development, providing detailed regulations for government administration, criminal and civil law, social hierarchy codified in legal status, penalties calibrated to the relationship between offender and victim, this code serving as model for later Chinese dynasties and for Korean and Japanese legal systems. Poetry reached heights of expression that still astonish. Li Bai, the romantic wanderer, writing of wine and friendship, mountains and exile, his verses seeming effortless, spontaneous, celebrating freedom and transcendence, while Du Fu, his contemporary, wrote with deep social conscience, documenting the sufferings of war, the separation of families, the corruption of officials, his craft meticulous, his compassion profound. Wang Wei, poet and painter, Buddhist layman, captured landscape in both words and images, his poetry visual, his paintings poetic, mountains emerging from mist, rivers winding through valleys, human figures tiny within vast nature, establishing conventions that would define Chinese landscape art for centuries. The examination system expanded during the Tang Jinshi degree, becoming the highest civil service qualification, thousands of candidates competing, only a few percent passing, success bringing prestige and office, failure meaning disappointment, and continued study or abandonment of scholarly ambitions for other pursuits. Buddhism reached its peak influence, temples and monasteries in every city and many rural areas, ordination conferring tax exemptions and other privileges, some estimates suggesting up to 200,000 monks and nuns by the 9th century. Concerns about Buddhist institutions accumulating too much wealth and drawing too many people away from productive labor, the great persecution of 845, ordered by Emperor Wuzong, forced thousands of monasteries to close, monks and nuns to return to lay life, precious metals confiscated. Though Buddhism survived this crisis, it never fully recovered its institutional power, becoming more integrated into popular religion, less of an independent force. The late Tang saw gradual decline, provincial military governors gaining autonomy, court politics dominated by eunuchs, tax revenues declining as powerful families found ways to avoid registration. The An Lushan rebellion of 755 devastated the north, the dynasty surviving but never fully recovering its earlier vigor. Poetry of the late Tang took on melancholy tones. Li Shangyin, writing verses of exquisite ambiguity, love and loss, political frustration, his imagery dense and elusive, demanding careful interpretation. Du Mu, looking back to earlier Tang glory, lamenting decline, writing of historical sites overgrown with weeds. When the Tang finally collapsed in 907, China again fragmented, the 5 dynasties period in the north, rapid turnover of short-lived regimes, 10 kingdoms in the south, some maintaining relative stability and prosperity, but the overall pattern was one of disunity and uncertainty. Yet this period of political chaos saw continued cultural development, the invention of woodblock printing becoming widespread, enabling the reproduction of texts on unprecedented scale, Buddhist sutras, Confucian classics, almanacs and encyclopedias, knowledge no longer confined to hand-copied manuscripts, the Song dynasty, 960 to 1279 of the Common Era, reunified most of China, though never conquering all the territory held by the Tang, facing powerful neighbors to the north, the Liao dynasty of the Khitan people, later the Jin dynasty of the Jurchen, and eventually the catastrophic Mongol invasions, but militarily weaker than the Tang. The Song was economically and culturally vibrant, a commercial revolution transforming society, paper money appearing, credit instruments, joint stock companies, maritime trade expanding, Chinese ships sailing to Southeast Asia, India, even East Africa, ceramics and silk exchanged for spices and exotic woods. Cities grew to unprecedented size. Kaifeng, the northern Song capital, over 1 million inhabitants, no longer confined to walled wards but sprawling, shops lining streets, entertainment districts, tea houses and theaters, restaurants offering regional cuisines, a urban culture of consumption and leisure. Neo-Confucianism emerged during the Song, scholars like Zhu Xi synthesizing Confucian ethics with metaphysical concepts drawn from Buddhism and Taoism, creating a comprehensive philosophical system addressing questions of cosmology and human nature, self-cultivation and social order, this synthesis becoming orthodox for the remainder of the imperial period. Landscape painting reached new heights. Monumental hanging scrolls depicting towering mountains and misty valleys, hand scrolls unrolling to reveal journeys through space and season. Scholar painters like Mi Fu and his son Mi Yuren developing distinctive styles, emphasizing brushwork and personal expression over literal representation. Ceramics achieved extraordinary refinement. The pale green celadons, white dingware with incised decorations, black jianware, tea bowls prized by Japanese tea practitioners, the famous junware with its opalescent glazes, each kiln site developing distinctive techniques, products traded throughout Asia. But the Song faced existential threats in 1127. Jurchen armies captured the capital Kaifeng and the emperor, forcing the court to flee south, the southern Song establishing a new capital at Hangzhou, abandoning the north, paying tribute to maintain peace, a humiliation that weighed on the Chinese historical consciousness. Hangzhou became perhaps the most sophisticated city in the world. Marco Polo would later describe it in amazed detail, though by the time he saw it, it was under Mongol rule, its canals and markets, pleasure boats and gardens, printing houses and schools, a urban civilization of remarkable complexity. The Mongol conquest, beginning with Genghis Khan's invasions in the early 13th century, culminating with Kublai Khan's final defeat of the Song in 1279, brought all of China under foreign rule for the first time. The Yuan dynasty, ruled by Mongol Khans, who were simultaneously Chinese emperors and part of a vast Eurasian empire. The Yuan period, 1271 to 1368, saw China integrated into the Mongol Empire's trade networks, the Silk Road flourishing under Pax Mongolica, merchants and missionaries traveling with relative safety from Europe to China, Though Mongol rule also brought hardship, ethnic hierarchies, suspicion of the Chinese educated class, many scholars withdrawing from government service. Drama flourished during the Yuan, perhaps because blocked from official careers, educated men turned to writing plays, creating a golden age of Chinese theater. Romantic comedies and historical tragedies, performances combining singing and dialogue, acrobatics and spectacle, plays like The Orphan of Zhao and Romance of the Western Chamber becoming classics. Painting also evolved as scholar amateur artists like Zhao Mengfu, developing styles that emphasized historical models and personal expression over realism. Literati painting becoming a distinct tradition, valuing brushwork and cultural allusion, disdaining professional decorative work, establishing aesthetic principles that would dominate later Chinese art. The Yuan dynasty fell to rebellion in 1368. Chinese rule restored under the Ming dynasty, which would last until 1644, a period of renovation and consolidation, of looking inward even as the world beyond China's borders was transforming. The Hongwu emperor, founder of the Ming, was born a peasant, orphaned young, surviving as a beggar and Buddhist novice before joining a rebel movement and rising to leadership through military skill and ruthless determination. His reign marked by suspicion of the educated class and brutal purges of suspected disloyalty. Yet the Ming also brought stability after the chaos of the Mongol collapse, agricultural recovery, population growth. The capital eventually moved from Nanjing to Beijing, where the Forbidden City was constructed, a vast palace complex, hundreds of buildings within high red walls, the architectural embodiment of imperial authority and cosmic order. The early Ming saw remarkable maritime expeditions. Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch admiral, leading massive fleets into the Indian Ocean between 1405 and 1433, ships far larger than contemporary European vessels, crews numbering in the thousands, visiting Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, the east coast of Africa, displaying Chinese power, collecting tribute, bringing back exotic animals and diplomatic missions. But these voyages were discontinued, deemed too expensive and unnecessary. China turning inward, restricting maritime trade, even as European explorers were beginning their age of oceanic expansion, a decision whose consequences would become apparent only centuries later. The Ming was a period of cultural refinement, blue and white porcelain reaching perfection, cobalt designs on white bodies, firing at high temperatures, producing wares exported throughout Asia and eventually to Europe. Where Chinese porcelain inspired imitation and wonder, the novel emerged as a serious literary form. Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Water Margin, Journey to the West. Long narrative works drawing on oral storytelling traditions, sophisticated in plot and characterization, achieving recognition alongside poetry as legitimate literature. The examination system expanded, more men competing for degrees, printing making books more accessible, private academies supplementing government schools, success in the exams offering the primary path to social advancement, though corruption and the difficulty of the tests also generated cynicism. But the Ming faced persistent challenges, northern border threats, first from Mongols, later from the Manchus, a people from beyond the Great Wall who would eventually conquer all of China, Japanese pirates raiding the coast, internal rebellions, fiscal problems. The late Ming saw intellectual ferment. Wang Yangming developing a school of Neo-Confucianism, emphasizing intuitive knowledge and unity of knowledge and action, challenging Jushi orthodoxy, his ideas spreading among educated elites, stimulating debate about the nature of moral understanding. European Jesuits arrived in the late 16th century. Matteo Ricci gaining entrance to the imperial court through his knowledge of mathematics and astronomy, Western learning beginning to trickle into China, round maps showing continents the Chinese had not known, mechanical clocks, new geometrical proofs, the first sustained intellectual exchange between China and Europe. The Ming fell not to foreign invasion but to internal collapse. Peasant rebellions driven by famine and misgovernment. A rebel army capturing Beijing in 1644. The last Ming emperor hanging himself on a hill behind the Forbidden City. And Manchu forces entering China ostensibly to restore order, but establishing their own dynasty, the Qing dynasty. 1644 to 1912 was China's last imperial dynasty. Manchu rulers who adopted Chinese governmental forms while maintaining their distinct identity, requiring Chinese men to wear the queue hairstyle as a sign of submission, initially facing resistance, but eventually presiding over territorial expansion and cultural flourishing. The Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong emperors of the 17th and 18th centuries brought the Qing to its height, territorial control extending to Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, Taiwan, population growing to over 300 million by the late 18th century, economic prosperity, cultural production on a massive scale. The Qianlong emperor was a prolific poet and art collector, sponsoring massive encyclopedic projects, the complete library of the four treasuries, attempting to gather and categorize all significant Chinese texts, though also conducting literary inquisitions, destroying works deemed seditious. The authoritarian impulse accompanying the preservationist one, but the Qing faced challenges that would ultimately prove insurmountable: population growth outpacing agricultural expansion, environmental degradation, corruption, and beginning in the 19th century, aggressive Western imperialism seeking to open Chinese markets and impose unequal treaties, the Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Uprising, reforms attempted and failing, revolution finally overthrowing the dynasty in 1912, ending over 2,000 years of imperial rule, China entering a period of upheaval that would reshape it fundamentally, and yet, standing at the river's edge again in my imagination, I realize that what endures is not the rise and fall of dynasties, not the dates of battles or the names of emperors, but something more elusive and more profound. It is the continuity of cultural practice, the unbroken thread of written language spanning millennia, characters evolving in form but maintaining recognizable connection to their ancient origins, enabling a Chinese reader today to encounter, with effort, texts written 2,000 years ago, to feel kinship across that vast temporal distance. It is the persistence of certain aesthetic values, the appreciation of negative space in painting, the calligraphic line that carries the energy of the writer's hand, the poem that suggests rather than states, finding beauty in restraint and implication, these principles established in ancient times, refined through successive generations, still resonant in contemporary art. It is the philosophical questions that each generation grappled with anew. how to balance individual cultivation with social responsibility, whether human nature tends toward good or requires strict shaping, how to create harmony between heaven and earth, between ruler and ruled, between self and society, Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist answers offering different paths, the conversation never fully resolved, the tension generative rather than paralyzing. The civil service examination system, for all its flaws, created something unprecedented, a bureaucracy based on learning rather than birth. The ideal, if not always the reality, that talent and effort could elevate anyone, that governance required education in ethics and history, that power should be exercised with cultural sophistication. The examination halls still stand in some cities, row upon row of tiny cells where candidates spent days writing their essays, hoping to demonstrate mastery of the classics, to craft the perfect regulated verse, to show both erudition and insight, the psychological pressure intense, the rewards for success substantial, this system shaping Chinese society for over a millennium. The landscape scrolls, whether Northern Song, Monumental Mountains, or Yuan, Literati Bamboo, offer a way of seeing, of understanding human relationship to nature, not domination but participation, the human figure often tiny within vast space, finding place rather than conquering territory. The mist that obscures as much as it reveals, suggesting mystery, incompleteness, the Tao that cannot be spoken. These paintings were meant to be unrolled slowly, experienced over time, a journey through space that is also a journey through consciousness, the eye following the path of a river, climbing with a scholar toward a mountain temple, resting in a grove of pines, the experience meditative, the landscape becoming interior as much as exterior. The ceramics tell their own story, the evolution from earthenware to high-fired porcelain, the mastery of glazes, copper red and cobalt blue, the celadons that seem to glow from within, each piece shaped by human hands and transformed by fire, functional objects elevated to art, daily life infused with aesthetic consideration. Tea drinking itself became a ritual, a way of cultivating presence and awareness, the careful preparation, the appreciation of color and aroma, the company of friends, simplicity revealing depth, the mundane transformed into the meaningful through attention and intention, the gardens, rocks, and water, pavilions and winding paths, windows framing views like living paintings, creating miniature worlds that compress and suggest the larger landscape, places for contemplation, for poetry composition, for the cultivation of refined sensibility, nature arranged but not dominated, wildness suggested within bounded space. All these practices, these forms, emerged from specific historical moments, were shaped by particular individuals and circumstances, yet they transcended their origins, becoming part of a cultural vocabulary that could speak across centuries, that could be reinterpreted and renewed, that could maintain identity while accommodating change, the dynastic cycle itself, the pattern of rise and fall, founding virtue and late corruption, natural disaster signaling heaven's withdrawal of mandate. This became a way of understanding historical time, not as progress towards some endpoint, but as perpetual oscillation, a pattern repeating with variation, human nature and cosmic principle playing out their eternal relationship, The mist on the yellow river thickens now in my mind's eye, and I feel the weight of all these centuries, not as burden, but as presence, the accumulated choices and creations of countless individuals, emperors and peasants, poets and potters, soldiers and monks, each living their particular life, each contributing to the vast tapestry. I think of the oracle bone diviners, carefully preparing the bones, carving their questions, interpreting the cracks, and how their script evolved into the characters still used today, 3,000 years of linguistic continuity, a bridge across time that few civilizations can claim. I think of the first emperor, building his terracotta army, burning the books, unifying weights and measures, his ambition terrible and magnificent, creating empire through force, yet the empire taking forms he could not have anticipated, outlasting his dynasty by millennia, becoming something other than what he intended. I think of the poets on the frontier, Du Fu writing of his thatched hut, damaged by autumn winds, worrying about the poor who have no shelter, his compassion surviving in verse, still moving readers, still asking us to see those who suffer. I think of the Buddhist pilgrims, walking for years to reach India, crossing deserts where earlier travelers had perished, driven by faith and curiosity, bringing back texts that would transform Chinese religion, creating new possibilities for thought and practice. I think of the craftspeople, the potters achieving perfect glazes after countless experiments, the scroll painters grinding their ink, stones, preparing silk or paper, attempting to capture mountain mist or bamboo swaying in wind, the accumulated skill and vision. The river flows on, carrying its yellow burden of loess, the same water and different water, perpetually changing and perpetually the same. This paradox that Chinese philosophers contemplated, that poets invoked, that painters suggested through mist and distance, the dynasties rose and fell like seasons, each bringing its particular gifts, each facing its inevitable decline, the pattern repetitive yet never exactly repeated, history as variation on themes, as elaboration of possibilities, as human nature encountering circumstance and creating culture, and what remains after all the palaces have crumbled, after all the emperors are dust, after the battles are forgotten, is this legacy of thought and making, of asking how to live well, of creating beauty, of seeking harmony, of recording and remembering. The scroll slowly rolling up, the ink fading on silk, the last light leaving the mountains, and somewhere a temple bell ringing across valleys, its sound carrying into silence, into the vast quiet, from which all things emerge and to which all things return. The river flowing, always flowing, through provinces and centuries, through memory and imagination, water that nourished the first millet crops, that filled the moats of imperial capitals, that carried trade goods south to north, that mirrored moon and mountain, that continues its patient journey to the sea, and I stand here at its edge, in this imagined space, as the mist closes in, the details softening, the specifics fading into general impression, the long story of ancient China becoming atmosphere, becoming feeling, becoming the quiet that follows deep contemplation, the last thought dissolving like mist, the last image blurring, the river and sky merging in gray, in silence, in the eternal now that holds all the vanished moments, all the forgotten names, all the extinguished lives, holding them gently, letting them rest, letting them be. There is something about fire, the way it reaches upward into darkness, the way it defies the pull of earth and climbs toward the stars. For thousands of years, humanity watched flames rise, watched sparks drift skyward in the night, and wondered what lay beyond the veil of atmosphere, beyond the ceiling of clouds and wind. The dream of flight is ancient, but the dream of leaving Earth entirely, of breaking free from gravity's patient grip, this dream required more than wings, more than wind. It required understanding something fundamental about the nature of motion itself, about action and reaction, about the simple and profound truth that pushing against something, anything, even the air itself, could create movement in the opposite direction. In the stillness of night, somewhere in ancient China, more than 1,000 years ago, someone watched bamboo tubes packed with a particular mixture of saltpeter and sulfur and charcoal, watched them burst into flame and leap from the fire, skittering across the ground with a hiss and a trail of sparks. And in that moment, perhaps without fully understanding it, witnessed the principle that would one day carry humanity beyond the atmosphere. The rocket is not like other machines. It does not push against the ground like a wheel, does not push against water like an oar, does not even push against air like a wing. Instead, it carries everything it needs within itself, its own fuel, its own means of combustion, its own path forward. It is fundamentally independent, a self-contained system of thrust and motion, and so the story begins not with a single inventor, not with one brilliant mind conceiving the whole idea as complete and perfect, but with centuries of gradual understanding, with fireworks masters in ancient dynasties, with alchemists mixing powders in medieval workshops, with natural philosophers asking questions about mass and acceleration and the laws that governed all movement. The night sky has always called to us. Those points of light scattered across the darkness, distant and unreachable, and yet somehow familiar, somehow important, as if we knew, even before we understood why, that reaching them would require us to become something more than we had been. In the beginning, rockets were simple things, tubes of paper or bamboo, filled with black powder, sealed at one end and open at the other. When ignited, the burning powder produced hot gases, and those gases, expanding rapidly, rushed out through the opening, and in rushing out, in escaping into the air, they pushed the tube in the opposite direction. This is Newton's third law. Though Newton had not yet been born to articulate it, action and reaction, equal and opposite. The rocket pushes against its own exhaust, and the exhaust pushes back. These early rockets were used for celebration, for warfare, for signaling across distances. Arrows fitted with small rocket tubes that could fly farther than any bow could send them. Fire arrows streaking through the air above battlefields, leaving trails of smoke and flame, terrifying to see, devastating in their effect. But they were also curiosity, spectacle, mystery. How could something fly with no visible means of support, with no wings, no lighter-than-air envelope, just a tube of burning powder somehow defying gravity, climbing into the sky until the fuel was spent, then falling back to Earth? The principle was sound, but the execution was crude. Early rockets were unpredictable. They wandered in flight, spun erratically, sometimes exploded, sometimes failed to ignite. They were as likely to endanger the launcher as the target. And yet the idea persisted because it worked, because even in its primitive form, the rocket demonstrated something profound, that thrust alone, pure directed force, could overcome gravity, could achieve motion through empty air, could reach heights that nothing else could reach. Centuries passed, and the knowledge spread from China westward along trade routes into the Islamic world, into Europe, each culture adapting the design, experimenting with different mixtures, different casings, different applications, always pushing, always trying to make the rocket more reliable, more powerful, more controllable. And always in the background of these practical efforts, there was the dream, the impossible dream, whispered about in stories and speculation, that perhaps one day, if the rocket could be made large enough, powerful enough, stable enough, it might carry something more than a warhead or a message. It might carry a person, might carry us beyond the sky, beyond the air, into that vast and silent realm where the stars dwell. This is where we begin in those early centuries, when the rocket was still a wonder, still half magic and half science, when no one could quite explain why it worked, only that it did, and that within that simple principle of thrust and reaction lay the seed of something extraordinary. The earliest reliable accounts speak of the 13th century, of the Song dynasty in China, of soldiers defending their cities against Mongol invaders, of arrows fitted with tubes of fire that flew farther and faster than anything drawn by bowstring alone. These fire arrows, or huojian, were simple in construction but revolutionary in concept. A hollow tube attached to the shaft of an arrow, packed with black powder, the powder a mixture refined over centuries by alchemists seeking immortality. Saltpeter and sulfur and charcoal ground together in precise proportions, each ingredient contributing something essential to the burning. When the powder ignited, it burned rapidly, producing vast quantities of hot gas. And this gas, trapped inside the tube, had nowhere to go but out through the opening at the rear, and as it rushed out, it pushed the arrow forward with tremendous force, carrying it hundreds of feet, sometimes more than 1,000 feet, distances impossible for ordinary archery. The Chinese military treatises of that era, documents like the Wujing Zongyao, the complete essentials from the military classics, described these weapons in careful detail, specified the ratios of ingredients, the length and diameter of the tubes, the methods of attachment to the arrow shaft. This was not magic. This was engineering, systematic and reproducible. But the weapons were unpredictable. The powder sometimes burned too fast, causing the tube to explode, sometimes too slow, causing the arrow to fall short. The tubes were made of paper or bamboo, materials that varied in strength and thickness, and the powder itself, ground by hand, was never quite uniform from batch to batch. Still, the principle was proven. Thrust could propel, force could overcome weight, and the knowledge began to spread, carried by traders and travelers, by the movement of armies and the exchange of ideas along the Silk Road. By the 13th and 14th centuries, accounts of rockets appeared in the Middle East. In the writings of Arab scholars and Persian historians, they called them Chinese arrows or fire lances, and they too began experimenting, modifying the designs, adapting them to their own purposes. In Europe, the knowledge arrived later, brought back perhaps by travelers returning from the East. By the late 13th century, the English monk and philosopher Roger Bacon wrote of black powder, described its composition, warned of its explosive properties, though whether he learned this from experimentation or from manuscripts copied from Eastern sources remains uncertain. The powder itself became known by many names. In Europe it was called serpentine, or simply gunpowder, and it transformed warfare. But for centuries, its primary use was in cannons and in bombards, in weapons that pushed projectiles out through tubes using the force of expanding gases. The rocket, the self-propelled version, remained a curiosity, a novelty. Europeans saw demonstrations, heard reports, but the technology did not take hold immediately, perhaps because cannons seemed more reliable, more controllable, easier to aim and predict. But in India, rockets evolved in a different direction. By the 18th century, the kingdom of Mysore in southern India had developed military rockets of remarkable sophistication. These were not simple fire arrows, but substantial weapons, iron tubes, sometimes 6 to 8 inches in diameter, attached to bamboo poles that served as stabilizers. The rockets of Mysore were filled with a hard-packed powder, compressed to create slower, more sustained burning, and this gave them greater range. They could fly more than a mile, and their iron casings made them far more destructive than the paper rockets of earlier centuries. The Sultan of Mysore, Hyder Ali, and later his son Tipu Sultan, deployed these rockets in battle against the British East India Company, launching them in volleys, hundreds at a time, the night sky filled with trails of sparks and flame. The sound tremendous, the psychological effect devastating. British officers, witnessing these attacks, wrote detailed reports, described the terror of facing an enemy that could strike from such distances with such fury, and these reports, these accounts of a weapon unlike anything in the European arsenal, eventually made their way back to England. One of those who read the reports with great interest was a man named William Congreve, the son of a British artillery officer, himself an inventor and experimenter, fascinated by the potential of rockets as military weapons. Congreve began his own experiments in the early 1800s, studying the Indian designs, attempting to improve upon them to create rockets that could be manufactured reliably, that could be aimed with some degree of accuracy, that could serve as legitimate weapons of war. He worked methodically, testing different powder formulations, different casing materials, different stabilizer designs. His rockets were built of iron with carefully machined interiors, and they ranged in size from small signal rockets to massive bombardment rockets weighing 32 pounds or more. The Congreve rocket, as it became known, was adopted by the British military in 1805, and it saw action in numerous conflicts, most famously in the bombardment of Fort McHenry during the War of 1812. The rocket's red glare, immortalized in the American national anthem, a reference to Congreve's weapons streaking through the night sky above Baltimore. These rockets were formidable, but they remained fundamentally limited. Their accuracy was poor. They tumbled and wavered in flight. A long stabilizing stick helped, but not enough. A rocket might be aimed at a fortress and land 100 yards away, or veer off course entirely. The problem was one of balance and design. The rocket pushed itself forward by throwing mass backward, but that mass, the exhaust, emerged from a single point, and any slight imperfection in the construction, any variation in how the powder burned, would cause the rocket to spin or tumble. Still, for certain purposes, they were effective, setting fires, creating chaos, bombarding coastal targets from ships offshore, and the very fact that they worked at all, that they could carry explosive payloads over distances of a mile or more, kept interest alive. In Russia, in the early 19th century, a military officer named Konstantin Konstantinov studied rockets extensively, traveled to England to observe Congreve's designs, returned to Russia, and established a rocket production facility. His work focused on standardization, on creating manufacturing processes that would produce consistent results. Konstantinov understood that the rocket's unreliability stemmed largely from inconsistency. No two rockets were quite the same, and so he developed tools for measuring, for ensuring that each rocket was built to exact specifications. His ballistic pendulum allowed him to measure thrust, to compare different powder mixtures scientifically. He also recognized that the long stabilizing stick, while helpful, was cumbersome and added weight, and he experimented with other stabilization methods, with fins, with spin stabilization, trying to make the rocket more practical as a weapon. But even as military rockets evolved, even as they became more powerful and more reliable, they remained secondary weapons, curiosities, useful in specific circumstances, but never quite matching the accuracy and consistency of conventional artillery. What kept the dream alive? What prevented rockets from being abandoned entirely was not their military utility, but the idea they represented, the principle they embodied. Here was a machine that needed nothing but itself, that carried its own fuel, its own oxidizer, that could operate in any environment, even theoretically, in the absence of air. And there were those who understood this, who saw beyond the immediate application to something far more profound, visionaries who looked at the rocket and saw not a weapon, but a vehicle, a means of transportation to places no other machine could reach. In Russia, in the late 19th century, a schoolteacher named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky began publishing articles about space travel, about the theoretical possibility of using rockets to escape Earth's gravity. He was largely self-taught, worked in isolation in the provincial town of Kaluga, but his mind ranged across the cosmos. Tsiolkovsky derived the fundamental equation of rocket motion, the relationship between exhaust velocity and the mass ratio, the rocket equation that would govern all future spaceflight. He understood that a rocket could work in a vacuum, that it needed no air to push against, that it pushed against its own exhaust and nothing else. He wrote of multi-stage rockets, of liquid fuels that would burn more efficiently than black powder, of spacecraft that would one day orbit the Earth, of colonies in space, and though his work was largely unknown outside of Russia, though he had no means to build the machines he imagined, he laid the theoretical foundation for everything that would follow. In America, a professor named Robert Goddard conducted similar research, working independently, arriving at many of the same conclusions. Goddard was more practically minded than Tsiolkovsky, more interested in building and testing actual hardware, and he recognized early on that liquid fuels would be essential for any serious attempt at high-altitude flight. Goddard experimented in secret, afraid of ridicule, afraid of being labeled a dreamer or a fool. He tested small rocket motors in his laboratory at Clark University, measured thrust and efficiency, worked out the engineering challenges of pumping fuel and oxidizer into a combustion chamber, of cooling the engine to prevent it from melting, of controlling the burn, and in 1920 he published a modest paper, a mathematical treatment of rocket physics titled A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes. The paper was sober and technical, filled with equations and diagrams, but buried in its appendix was a single speculative paragraph suggesting that a rocket might one day reach the moon. The press seized on this idea, mocked it, published cartoons and editorials ridiculing the notion. One editorial famously stated that Goddard lacked even a high school understanding of physics, that a rocket could not work in the vacuum of space because it would have nothing to push against. The ridicule stung, and Goddard retreated further into privacy, but he continued his work, and on a cold day in March of 1926, on a farm in Auburn, Massachusetts, he launched the world's first liquid-fueled rocket. It flew for only 2.5 seconds, reached an altitude of 41 feet, landed in a cabbage patch. But it flew, and in flying, proved that liquid propulsion was possible. The rocket was small, almost delicate, 10 feet tall, constructed of thin metal tubing. The fuel was gasoline. The oxidizer, liquid oxygen, kept cold in an insulated tank. The engine itself was mounted at the top, an inverted arrangement with the rocket hanging from its combustion chamber like a child's toy suspended from a string. Goddard had chosen this design deliberately, placing the heavy engine above the fuel tanks, believing it would provide stability, like a dart, with the weight forward, though later he would reverse this, realizing that engines belonged at the base, that thrust should push rather than pull. The fuel system was ingenious. Pressurized tanks feeding liquid through simple valves into a combustion chamber where they mixed and ignited, the engine bell directing the exhaust downward, converting the chaotic energy of burning fuel into focused thrust. And for those 2.5 seconds, it worked. The rocket rose, hesitated, then arced over and fell. But in that brief moment, something fundamental had changed. The era of solid propellant, of black powder packed into casings, was ending, and the era of liquid fuel, of precisely controlled combustion, of engines that could be throttled and steered, was beginning. Goddard continued his experiments through the 1920s and 30s. Moving to New Mexico, where the open desert provided space and privacy, his rockets grew larger, more sophisticated. He developed gyroscopic stabilization systems, movable vanes in the exhaust stream for steering, parachute recovery systems to retrieve his rockets intact after flight. By 1935, one of his rockets reached an altitude of 7,600 feet, traveling faster than the speed of sound. These were remarkable achievements, proof that liquid rockets could reach heights and speeds impossible for solid fuel designs, and yet Goddard worked in obscurity, funded by modest grants, building everything himself with a small team of assistants. He was secretive by nature, protective of his ideas, filing patents but publishing little, and this isolation, while it allowed him to work without interference, also meant that his innovations spread slowly, that others working on similar problems could not benefit from his discoveries. In Germany, in the 1920s and 30s, a different approach was taking shape. There, Rocket enthusiasts formed societies, shared knowledge openly, conducted public demonstrations. The Verein für Raumschiffahrt, the Society for Space Travel, brought together engineers and dreamers, people who believed that space travel was not fantasy but engineering, a problem to be solved through systematic effort. Among them was a young engineering student named Werner von Braun, brilliant and charismatic, fascinated by rockets since childhood. He had read the works of the visionaries, Tsiolkovsky, Hermann Oberth, understood the mathematics, but wanted to build, to test, to make the dream tangible. The society conducted experiments with small liquid-fueled rockets, launched them from fields outside Berlin, documented their failures and successes, and gradually their work attracted attention, including the attention of the German military, who saw in rockets a potential weapon, a way to strike at enemies from great distances without violating the Treaty of Versailles, which prohibited long-range artillery but said nothing about rockets. Von Braun, eager for funding and resources, accepted an offer to work for the German army, and by the mid-1930s, he was directing a secret rocket development program at Peenemünde, a remote facility on the Baltic coast. There, with virtually unlimited funding and access to Germany's best engineers, the work progressed rapidly. The goal was to create a ballistic missile, a rocket that could carry a warhead hundreds of miles, that could be launched from mobile platforms, that could strike with little warning. The technical challenges were immense. The rocket would need to be large, powerful enough to lift a ton of explosives, stable enough to fly a precise trajectory, and reliable enough to be manufactured in quantity. Through years of testing and failure, through countless design iterations, the team at Peenemünde developed the L4 rocket, later renamed the V2 Vergeltungswaffe 2, Vengeance Weapon 2, a machine that represented the culmination of decades of rocket development. The V2 stood 46 feet tall, weighed nearly 13 tons when fueled. Its engine burned a mixture of ethyl alcohol and liquid oxygen, producing 56,000 pounds of thrust, enough to lift the rocket to the edge of space to an altitude of 50 miles or more before the engine shut down and the rocket followed a ballistic arc to its target. The guidance system used gyroscopes and an analog computer, simple by later standards, but revolutionary for its time. It measured acceleration, calculated position, adjusted the rocket's trajectory using graphite veins in the exhaust stream, and when the correct velocity was reached, it shut down the engine. Everything that followed was physics, gravity and momentum carrying the warhead to impact. On the 3rd of October, 1942, the first successful V2 launch took place. The rocket climbed into the autumn sky above Peenemünde, its exhaust a brilliant white column, and for the first time in human history, a machine reached space, crossed the Kármán line, the boundary where atmosphere gives way to void. Von Braun and his team celebrated. One engineer reportedly said, "Today the spaceship was born. They understood that what they had created was more than a weapon. It was proof that space travel was possible, that rockets could overcome gravity, could reach beyond the atmosphere. But the V2 was born into war, and its purpose was destruction. Beginning in September of 1944, the rockets were fired at London, at Antwerp, at other Allied cities. They arrived without warning, faster than sound. The first sign of their approach was the explosion, then the sonic boom, then the fading rumble of the rocket's passage through the air. More than 3,000 V-2s were launched in combat, killing thousands of civilians, and though they had little strategic impact on the war's outcome, though they came too late and were too inaccurate to change the tide of battle, they demonstrated something that could not be ignored. The rocket, as a technology, had matured, had become practical, had become powerful. As the war ended, as Allied forces advanced into Germany from both east and west, teams of soldiers and scientists raced to capture the rocket facilities, to seize the documentation, the hardware. The engineers themselves, the Americans and Soviets, both understood that rocket technology would be crucial in whatever conflicts lay ahead. Von Braun and most of his team surrendered to American forces, along with enough components to build dozens of V-2s. They were brought to the United States, along with captured rockets, and began working for the American military, transferring their knowledge, teaching American engineers what they had learned. In the Soviet Union, captured German engineers were put to work as well, forced to recreate the V-2, to train Soviet engineers in its operation and construction. The Soviets reverse engineered everything, documented every component, and then began developing their own designs, improving on what the Germans had built. And so began the Great Expansion, the era when rockets ceased to be curiosities or experimental devices and became central to national defense, to scientific research, to the growing competition between superpowers. In the American desert at White Sands, proving ground in New Mexico, captured V-2s were launched, 67 of them over the course of several years, each flight a test, each flight carrying instruments into the upper atmosphere, measuring radiation, temperature, atmospheric composition, taking photographs from altitudes that revealed the curvature of Earth. Scientists placed fruit flies aboard, mice, even monkeys, testing the effects of high acceleration and brief weightlessness. The rockets climbed to heights of over 100 miles, then fell back. Sometimes the payloads were recovered. Sometimes they were destroyed on impact. But data was gathered, knowledge accumulated. The V-2 program taught American engineers how to build large rockets, how to handle cryogenic propellants, how to test and troubleshoot complex systems. But the V-2 itself was limited. It was a weapon converted awkwardly to scientific use. What was needed was something new, something designed from the start for the demands of space flight. And so the refinement began. The V-2 spawned successors, the Viking rocket, the Redstone, each incorporating improvement, better engines, more efficient fuel mixtures, more sophisticated guidance. The rockets grew more reliable, their flights more predictable. At the same time, new propellants were being explored. Researchers discovered that kerosene burned more efficiently than alcohol, that hydrogen, the lightest element, offered even better performance if its extreme cold could be managed. New oxidizers were tested, nitric acid, nitrogen tetroxide, each with advantages and drawbacks, each requiring different materials, different handling procedures. The Soviet Union pursued parallel development under the direction of Sergei Korolev, a brilliant engineer who had survived Stalin's purges and the gulags, who emerged from imprisonment to lead the Soviet rocket program. Korolev drove his teams relentlessly, pushed for ever larger rockets, ever greater capabilities. By the early 1950s, Both nations were developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, rockets capable of carrying nuclear warheads across continents. These were massive machines, far larger than the V-2, requiring engines of tremendous power, and their development pushed rocket technology forward at an unprecedented pace. But alongside the military applications, alongside the missiles and warheads, another possibility was emerging, the idea that these same rockets, with their ever-increasing power, might finally achieve what the visionaries had dreamed, might carry something beyond weapons into space, might launch satellites, spacecraft, even people, into orbit around Earth. The race to orbit began quietly, with calculations and proposals, with engineers sketching designs for satellites, small machines that could be placed in orbit around Earth, circling endlessly, held by gravity but moving too fast to fall, a balance between velocity and attraction that would keep them aloft indefinitely. The mathematics were well understood. To achieve orbit, a rocket had to reach a speed of approximately 17,500 miles per hour at an altitude above the atmosphere. Anything slower and it would fall back. Anything faster and it might escape Earth's gravity entirely. The challenge was not theoretical but practical. Building an engine powerful enough, a structure light enough, a guidance system precise enough. Both the United States and the Soviet Union announced plans to launch satellites during the International Geophysical Year, a period of coordinated scientific research spanning 1957 and 1958. The announcements were public, but the programs themselves were shrouded in secrecy, each nation guarding its progress, its methods, its timeline. The Soviets moved first on the 4th of October, 1957. A rocket lifted off from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, a modified R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile. Its core stage flanked by 4 strap-on boosters, the configuration gave it tremendous thrust, enough to carry a payload beyond the atmosphere. Atop the rocket sat Sputnik, a sphere of polished metal, 23 inches in diameter, weighing 184 pounds. It carried a radio transmitter, nothing more. But when the rocket placed it into orbit, when its signal began broadcasting back to Earth, a series of steady beeps, the world changed. For the first time, humanity had placed an object in orbit, had created an artificial moon, and anyone with a radio receiver could hear its voice, that steady pulse passing overhead every 96 minutes. A harbinger of a new age, the psychological impact was profound, especially in the United States, where the news was received with shock and dismay. The Soviets, who had been perceived as technologically inferior, had achieved something remarkable, had beaten America into space. The implications for national security were clear. A rocket that could place a satellite in orbit could also deliver a warhead anywhere on Earth. The American response was urgent, chaotic. Multiple rocket programs competed for resources and attention. The Navy's Vanguard, the Army's Jupiter, each promised to launch a satellite quickly, to reclaim prestige. But the Vanguard rocket failed spectacularly in December of 1957, exploding on the launch pad in front of television cameras. The humiliation was public and complete. Finally, on the 31st of January, 1958, a Jupiter C rocket designed by von Braun's team successfully placed Explorer 1 into orbit, America's first satellite. It weighed only 30 pounds, carried a cosmic ray detector built by James Van Allen, and its instruments made an immediate discovery: radiation belts surrounding Earth, trapped particles spiraling along magnetic field lines, the Van Allen belts, proof that space was not empty, but filled with invisible hazards. The space age had begun in earnest, and what followed was an escalation, each success prompting a more ambitious attempt. The Soviets launched Sputnik 2 in November of 1957, carrying a dog named Laika, the first living creature to orbit Earth. Though the mission was one way, no provision made for return. Laika died in orbit, but the flight proved that life could survive launch and weightlessness. The rockets themselves evolved rapidly. Engines grew more powerful. New fuel combinations were tested: liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, hypergolic propellants that ignited on contact, each offering different advantages. Hydrogen gave the highest efficiency, the most thrust per pound of fuel, but it was difficult to handle, boiling away at temperatures near absolute zero, requiring elaborate insulation and refrigeration. Kerosene was denser, easier to store, produced greater thrust from a smaller engine, and so it became the fuel of choice for first stages for the initial climb through the atmosphere, while hydrogen powered the upper stages, the final push to orbital velocity. Staging itself became more sophisticated. The V2 had been a single stage, burning all its fuel, then falling back. But orbital rockets required multiple stages, each one igniting as the previous stage burned out and separated, shedding dead weight, allowing the remaining rocket to accelerate more efficiently. Korolev's R-7 used a unique approach. The 4 strap-on boosters ignited at launch alongside the core stage, all 5 engines burning together. Then the boosters separated while the core continued. This parallel staging gave tremendous initial thrust, lifted the heavy rocket through the thick lower atmosphere, and the design became the foundation for the Soyuz rocket, which, decades later, would still be launching cosmonauts into space. In America, new rocket families emerged: the Thor, the Atlas, the Titan, each designed originally as a missile, each adapted for spaceflight. The Atlas used a unique balloon structure, the thin stainless steel pressurized with fuel to maintain rigidity. It was light but fragile, and its engines were powerful, burning kerosene and liquid oxygen, producing hundreds of thousands of pounds of thrust. The development was expensive, dangerous. Rockets exploded regularly on the pad, in flight. The early success rate was perhaps 50%. Each failure investigated, each problem addressed. The learning curve was steep and paid for in destroyed hardware and shattered schedules, but gradually reliability improved by the early 1960s. Both nations could launch satellites routinely, could place scientific instruments into orbit, could begin thinking about the next impossible step, sending not just machines but people into space. The human body was fragile, evolved for Earth's gravity, for sea-level air pressure, or for protection from radiation. Space offered none of these. It was vacuum, extreme temperatures, cosmic rays. Micrometeoroids traveling at miles per second. To send a person into orbit required solving problems beyond rocketry, required life support systems, pressure suits, heat shields for re-entry. The Soviets again moved first on the 12th of April, 1961. Yuri Gagarin, a 27-year-old pilot, rode a Vostok rocket into orbit. His capsule was spherical, automated. He was a passenger more than a pilot. But he orbited Earth once, 108 minutes from launch to landing, and returned safely, the first human to see Earth from space, to experience weightlessness, to prove that people could survive beyond the atmosphere. 3 weeks later, Alan Shepard, aboard a Mercury capsule atop a Redstone rocket, made America's first crewed flight, a suborbital arc, 15 minutes from launch to splashdown, reaching space but not achieving orbit. Still, it was a beginning, and it prompted President Kennedy, responding to the continued Soviet lead, to announce in May of 1961 that America would land a man on the moon before the decade's end. The declaration was audacious, shocking even to NASA's own engineers. The United States had barely achieved 15 minutes of spaceflight. The moon was 240,000 miles away. The technology needed did not exist. The rockets powerful enough had not been designed. No one knew how to navigate in space, how to dock two spacecraft together, how to land on another world and return, but the goal was set, and the resources followed. NASA's budget increased dramatically. Factories were built, test facilities constructed, thousands of engineers hired. The entire endeavor became a national project, a demonstration of will and capability. New rockets were needed, much larger than anything yet flown. The Saturn family, designed under von Braun's direction, the Saturn I, then the Saturn 1B, and finally the Saturn V, the largest, the most powerful, a rocket that stood 363 feet tall, that weighed over 6 million pounds when fueled, that produced 7.5 million pounds of thrust from its first stage alone. The Saturn V's first stage burned kerosene and liquid oxygen through 5 F-1 engines, the most powerful rocket engines ever flown. Each one a masterpiece of engineering, pumping 3 tons of propellant per second into combustion chambers where temperatures exceeded 5,000 degrees. The turbopumps alone generated more horsepower than a destroyer's engines. The second stage used 5 J2 engines burning liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. More efficient but less powerful, optimized for operation in the thin upper atmosphere and vacuum. And the third stage, a single J2, provided the final push, either into Earth orbit or, when reignited, the trans-lunar injection burn that would send Apollo spacecraft towards the moon. Testing the Saturn V was itself a monumental task. Each component had to be proven, engines test-fired for their full duration, stages assembled and checked, the entire rocket stacked in the vehicle assembly building, a structure so large it had its own weather, clouds forming near the ceiling on humid days. The first uncrewed flight, Apollo 4, launched in November of 1967. Every system worked. The rocket performed flawlessly, and within 2 years, in July of 1969, Apollo 11 carried Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the moon's surface while Michael Collins orbited above. The landing was achieved with a descent stage engine that could be throttled, adjusted in real time, guided by computer and by Armstrong's hand on the controls. The lunar module touched down with less than 30 seconds of fuel remaining, and when Armstrong stepped onto the surface, when his boot pressed into the gray dust, the dream that had begun with watching fire rise into darkness, with wondering what lay beyond the sky, became reality. 6 Apollo missions landed on the moon between 1969 and 1972. 12 people walked on its surface, conducted experiments, collected samples, drove rovers across the landscape, and each time the journey began with a Saturn V, with fire and thunder, with the sustained violence of controlled explosion lifting mass against gravity's pull. But the moon landings, though spectacular, were not sustainable. The Saturn V was expensive. Each launch cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and once the goal was achieved, once the race was won, public interest waned, funding decreased, the last 3 planned Apollo missions were canceled, and the final Saturn V sat unused, eventually displayed as a museum piece. The focus shifted toward space stations, toward reusable spacecraft, toward a model of spaceflight that could be sustained, that did not require building a new rocket for each mission. The space shuttle emerged from this vision, a spacecraft that launched like a rocket but landed like an airplane, that could carry crews and cargo to orbit and return, and yet, for all its complexity, the shuttle still relied on the same fundamental principle, on thrust and reaction, on burning fuel to produce hot gas, on directing that gas downward to create upward motion. The solid rocket boosters, the largest ever flown, provided most of the initial thrust, each one burning 11 tons of propellant, and the main engines, fed from the enormous external tank, burned liquid hydrogen and oxygen with extraordinary efficiency. The shuttle flew for 30 years, from 1981 to 2011, 135 missions, building the International Space Station, launching satellites and telescopes, conducting countless experiments, but it never achieved the routine access to space that had been promised. It remained complex, expensive, and fragile. 2 orbiters were lost, Challenger in 1986, Columbia in 2003, 14 astronauts killed. Meanwhile, rockets continued to evolve elsewhere, in Russia, in Europe, in China, India, Japan, each nation developing launchers suited to their needs. The expendable rockets proved more economical for most purposes, simpler, more reliable, and the technology matured into a stable, almost routine capability by the early 21st century. Why, as rockets could place satellites into orbit with remarkable precision, could send probes to every planet in the solar system, could support a permanent human presence aboard the International Space Station, and yet the cost remained high, access remained limited, and the dream of widespread space flight, of routine travel beyond Earth, remained unfulfilled. Then, quietly at first, a new approach began to emerge, not from governments but from private companies, from entrepreneurs who looked at the rockets of the past and asked, why do we throw them away? Why not recover them, refurbish them, fly them again? The question was simple, almost obvious in hindsight. Why had no one seriously attempted it before? Perhaps because the engineering seemed impossible. A rocket descending from space, enduring temperatures of thousands of degrees, decelerating from hypersonic speeds, then landing gently, precisely, ready to fly again. The forces involved were extreme, the margins for error non-existent. But in the early 2000s, a company called SpaceX, founded by an entrepreneur who had made his fortune in software, began working on exactly this problem, recovering and reusing rockets, turning launch vehicles into something more like aircraft, machines that could fly repeatedly, that could be refurbished between flights rather than rebuilt from scratch. The technical challenges were immense. A rocket stage falling back to Earth accelerated to tremendous speeds, heated by friction with the atmosphere. To slow it down, to control its descent, required reigniting the engines, burning fuel in reverse, using thrust to brake, and then, in the final moments, landing vertically on extended legs, balancing on a column of fire. The first attempts failed. Rockets tumbled, crashed into the ocean, exploded on barges. But each failure taught something. Each test refined the control algorithms, improved the landing legs, adjusted the fuel reserves, and gradually, impossibly, it began to work. In December of 2015, a Falcon 9 first stage, after launching satellites toward orbit, returned to Cape Canaveral, descended through the night sky, and landed upright on a concrete pad, its engines burning blue and white, the sound rolling across the Florida coast like distant thunder. It was the first orbital-class rocket booster ever recovered intact after flight. More landings followed, some on land, some on autonomous drone ships positioned in the ocean. The boosters became reliable, routine within a few years. SpaceX was flying the same booster multiple times, 10 flights, 15, 20, proving that rockets could be reused, that the economics of spaceflight could fundamentally change. Other companies followed, developed their own reusable designs, their own approaches to recovery and refurbishment, and slowly the industry began to transform. Launch costs decreased. Access to space expanded. Satellites proliferated, forming constellations that provided internet coverage, Earth observation, communications. But beyond the practical applications, beyond the economics and the engineering, something deeper was happening. Rockets were becoming less mysterious, less singular. They were still dangerous, still spectacular, but they were no longer impossible, no longer the exclusive domain of superpowers. Small companies could build them. Universities could launch payloads. The barrier was lowering, and as it lowered, as access expanded, the old dreams revived. Plans for permanent bases on the moon, for missions to Mars, for mining asteroids, for building structures in orbit. These were no longer pure fantasy. They were engineering projects, difficult, expensive, but achievable with enough time and resources. The rockets themselves continued to grow. The Falcon Heavy, 3 Falcon 9 cores strapped together, producing over 5 million pounds of thrust, capable of lifting massive payloads to orbit or sending spacecraft toward the outer planets, and then even larger designs. Starship, a fully reusable system, both stages designed to return and land, to be flown again within hours, a vision of space flight, more like aviation than like the expendable rockets of the past. These new vehicles burned methane rather than kerosene, a fuel that could theoretically be manufactured on Mars, that left less residue in the engines, that offered a path toward true reusability, toward spacecraft that could refuel in orbit or on other worlds, that could journey not just to space but through it, to destinations across the solar system. The engines evolved as well. Some used traditional bell nozzles, carefully shaped to maximize efficiency. Others experimented with aerospike designs, with new combustion cycles, with additive manufacturing that allowed complex internal geometries impossible to machine. Each generation more efficient, more powerful, more reliable than the last. And through all this development, through all these decades of refinement and innovation, the fundamental principle never changed: thrust and reaction, burning fuel to produce high-velocity exhaust, directing that exhaust to create motion in the opposite direction. It was the same principle that had propelled fire arrows across medieval battlefields, the same physics that Tsiolkovsky had described in his quiet study, the same force that Goddard had harnessed in his cabbage patch. But the understanding had deepened. The execution had been perfected. What was once uncertain and dangerous had become, if not routine, at least reliable, predictable, a mature technology built on a foundation of accumulated knowledge, of lessons learned through failure and success, of incremental improvements compounding over time. The rockets flying today are marvels, structures of incredible precision, engines of extraordinary complexity, guidance systems that calculate trajectories in real time, that adjust for wind and weather, that can land a booster on a platform the size of a tennis court while traveling thousands of miles per hour. And yet they are still, at their core, tubes filled with fuel, nozzles directing exhaust, the same basic architecture as the V-2, as Goddard's prototype, as the Chinese fire arrows. What changed was not the principle, but the mastery, the understanding of materials that could withstand extreme temperatures, of pumps that could move tons of cryogenic liquid per second, of computers that could control combustion with millisecond precision, of manufacturing techniques that could produce engines reliably, identically, again and again. And so we arrive at the present moment, at a time when rockets launch almost weekly, when payloads reach orbit routinely, when the International Space Station has been continuously inhabited for more than 2 decades, when rovers explore Mars, when probes have visited every planet and ventured into interstellar space, all of it made possible by rockets, by the patient refinement of a technology that began as spectacle and warfare and became the key to leaving Earth. The future remains uncertain, but the possibilities are visible. Bases on the moon, where astronauts work for months at a time. Missions to Mars carrying crews who will spend years away from Earth. Telescopes placed at distant points in space, revealing the universe with unprecedented clarity, perhaps even eventually. Journeys to the outer planets, to the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, to places we have seen only through the eyes of our robotic emissaries. All of this rests on rockets, on that simple and profound principle of action and reaction, on our ability to generate thrust, to overcome gravity, to carry ourselves and our instruments beyond the atmosphere. It is a testament to human ingenuity, to persistence, to the willingness to dream impossible things and then, methodically, patiently, make them real. The night sky still calls to us, those distant points of light. And now we have the means to answer, not yet easily, not yet cheaply, but reliably. We can build machines that leave Earth, that operate in the void, that return with knowledge and with proof that we can survive beyond our world. The rockets stand on their pads, tall and white against the sky, fueled and waiting. Inside them, liquid oxygen and hydrogen at temperatures that would freeze flesh instantly. Pumps spinning at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute, computers running through final checks, and then, when everything is ready, when all the systems align, the engines ignite, fire blooms at the base, white and impossibly bright. The sound follows, a physical force, a sustained roar that shakes the ground for miles, and slowly, fighting gravity with every ounce of thrust, the rocket begins to rise, at first barely moving, hanging on its column of fire, then accelerating, faster and faster, the exhaust trail lengthening behind it, a pillar of cloud reaching from earth to sky. And as it climbs, as it shrinks to a point of light and then disappears entirely, it carries with it centuries of accumulated knowledge, the dreams of visionaries who never saw their ideas fulfilled, the work of engineers who solved problems piece by piece, the courage of those who rode these machines into the unknown, all of it concentrated into this moment, this flight, this reaching upward into darkness. The rockets are magnificent, but they are also familiar now. We have seen them launch 1,000 times, watched them land, watched them fly again. They are no longer miracles but tools, sophisticated and powerful, but understood, controllable, ours to use as we venture outward, as we take our first tentative steps beyond the world that made us. And perhaps that is the real achievement, not any single flight, not any particular mission, but the transformation of the impossible into the routine, the conversion of dreams into engineering, the patient building of capability, one test, one failure, one success at a time, until what once seemed like magic became simply flight. The flame still reaches upward, still climbs toward the stars. But now we understand it. Now we ride it. Now we use it to carry ourselves beyond the sky, to places our ancestors could only imagine. And the journey has just begun. The rockets are ready. The destinations are waiting, and the flame, the ancient flame that first made us wonder, now lifts us toward answers. I can imagine a library at dusk, the kind of room where light falls through tall windows in slanted beams, and dust moves slowly through the air like something weightless and alive, moving without hurry, drifting in currents I cannot see. The shelves rise high along the walls, wood aged dark with time, and leather-bound volumes rest in rows that seem to stretch beyond counting, their spines embossed with letters in languages that shimmer faintly gold: Latin, French, German, English, each one a doorway into thought, into conversations that happened centuries ago in rooms not unlike this one. There is a desk near the window, oak or perhaps mahogany, its surface worn smooth by the touch of hands long turned to dust, and upon it rest objects that speak of careful study, a brass candlestick with wax pooled at its base, an inkwell of dark glass, a quill that once scratched urgently across parchment in the hours when darkness pressed against the glass, recording ideas that would reshape the world. Outside, through those tall windows, I can see the outline of formal gardens, geometric patterns of hedge and gravel path, the architecture of reason imposed upon the natural world, and beyond them, the suggestion of a city, rooftops and chimneys, church spires, rising into a sky that holds the last pale wash of daylight, fading now, giving way to something deeper. This is Europe in the 18th century, though the seeds were planted earlier, in coffee houses and salons, in correspondence that traveled by coach across rutted roads, in printing houses where metal type was set by hand, letter by letter, word by word, building arguments and treatises that would circulate from Paris to Edinburgh, from Amsterdam to Philadelphia, carrying with them the revolutionary notion that human beings might use reason, observation, and critical thinking to understand their world. The air in this library holds a quality of anticipation, as if the books themselves are aware of their contents, the dangerous and beautiful ideas they contain. Ideas about natural rights, about government deriving its power from the consent of the governed, about the possibility that knowledge might be systematized, that superstition might yield to science, that darkness, both literal and metaphorical, might be driven back by the application of human intelligence. I can see a globe on a side table, terrestrial sphere mounted in a wooden frame, its surface marked with continents and seas as they were understood then. Some coastlines accurate, others speculative, blank spaces waiting to be filled by exploration and measurement, by the application of systematic observation, the same principles that were being turned upon nature, upon society, upon the human condition itself. The candlelight flickers, casting moving shadows that climb the walls, and I think of other candles burning in other rooms, in other cities across this continent and beyond, each one a small rebellion against the night, each one illuminating pages where someone bent their mind to questions that had been answered for centuries by tradition and authority, and dared to ask them again, to test the old answers against evidence, against logic, against the radical proposition that truth might be discovered rather than he inherited. There is something almost sacred in this quiet, not the silence of a church, but the profound stillness of concentration, of minds at work across time, building upon one another's discoveries, arguing, refining, pushing back the boundaries of what could be known, what could be questioned, what could be reimagined. The light continues to fade beyond the windows, and the room grows dimmer. But there is no sense of urgency, no need to light more candles just yet. This threshold between day and night, this liminal space, feels appropriate somehow for contemplating an age that existed in its own kind of threshold between the old world of divine right and revealed truth and a new world still being born, still taking shape in pamphlets and encyclopedias, in scientific societies and philosophical correspondence, in conversations that stretched late into the night in rooms like this one. And so I settle here in this imagined library that holds within it the essence of countless real libraries, real studies, real spaces where the Enlightenment unfolded, and I prepare to trace the arc of that extraordinary period when humanity turned its gaze upon itself with new eyes and asked with unprecedented boldness what we might become. The roots reach back further than the 18th century, back into soil that was being turned and prepared, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not, by minds that would not live to see the harvest. In the middle of the 17th century, a man named René Descartes sat in a room warmed by a stove and decided to doubt everything, to strip away every assumption, every inherited belief, until he arrived at something he could not doubt. And what he found in that methodical demolition of certainty was the thinking self. I think, therefore I am, a foundation built not on scripture or tradition, but on the application of reason to the question of existence itself. This was radical, not because doubt was new, but because Descartes made it systematic, made it a method, a tool that could be applied to any question, and in doing so, He helped forge one of the implements that would shape the age to come. Across the Channel in England, another kind of foundation was being laid. Francis Bacon had argued earlier in that same century for a new approach to understanding nature, not through the contemplation of ancient texts, but through observation, through experiment, through the patient gathering of evidence. He imagined a collaborative enterprise of discovery, natural philosophers working together, building knowledge brick by brick through empirical investigation. These were whispers of what would become a roar, scattered voices that would eventually combine into a chorus. The middle decades of the 1600s saw something extraordinary taking shape. In 1660, the Royal Society was founded in London, a gathering of men interested in natural philosophy, what we would now call science. They met to discuss experiments, to witness demonstrations, to correspond with like-minded individuals across Europe, creating networks of knowledge that transcended national boundaries. Robert Boyle conducted his experiments with air pumps, demonstrating the properties of gases, reducing natural phenomena to mechanical principles that could be tested, measured, repeated. Robert Hooke peered through his microscope and revealed a hidden universe of cellular structure, of tiny architectures invisible to the naked eye, each observation chipping away at the Aristotelian certainty that had dominated European thought for 1,000 years. And then came Isaac Newton, who would become, for the Enlightenment, something like a patron saint of reason. In 1687, he published his Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. And in those pages, he demonstrated that the same laws governing a falling apple governed the motion of planets, that the universe operated according to mathematical principles, elegant, comprehensible, knowable. The impact cannot be overstated. Here was proof that human reason could unlock the deepest secrets of creation, that the cosmos was not mysterious and capricious, but orderly, and that this order could be expressed in equations, in laws that held true from the Earth to the farthest visible stars. Alexander Pope would later write, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." And while this was poetic exaggeration, it captured something real about how Newton's achievement was perceived as a kind of revelation, not through divine inspiration, but through the application of mathematics and reason to careful observation. In the coffee houses of London, a new social space was emerging, places where men from different stations could gather, where conversation flowed as freely as the bitter, dark brew from the Ottoman world, where newspapers were read aloud, where ideas were debated, where information circulated in ways that bypassed traditional hierarchies of church and aristocracy. These were nodes in a growing network. Similar spaces were appearing across Europe, salons in Paris, coffee houses in Amsterdam, places where the public sphere was being born, where private citizens could engage with ideas, with politics, with questions about how a society should be organized, questions that had previously been the exclusive domain of monarchs and theologians. John Locke, writing in the aftermath of England's glorious revolution of 1688, articulated principles that would echo through the Enlightenment and beyond in his two treatises of government. He argued that political authority derived not from divine right, but from a social contract, that government existed to protect natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and that when government failed in this duty, the people had the right to dissolve it. This was philosophical dynamite, wrapped in careful prose. It relocated the source of political legitimacy from heaven to earth, from the anointed monarch to the consent of the governed. And while Locke himself was defending a particular English settlement, his arguments contained implications that would travel far beyond their immediate context. In his essay concerning human understanding, Locke also proposed that the human mind began as a blank slate, a tabula rasa, written upon by experience. There were no innate ideas, no predetermined knowledge. Everything we knew came through our senses, through our engagement with the world. This meant that human beings were not born into fixed stations determined by divine will, but were shaped by their environment, by their education, by their experiences. And if that was true, then human beings could be improved. Society could be reformed. The future was not simply the repetition of the past, but something that could be consciously shaped through the application of reason and the reform of institutions. The early decades of the 1700s saw these ideas begin to percolate more widely, to cross borders, to inspire imitation and elaboration. Correspondence networks expanded, learned journals proliferated, the Republic of Letters, that imagined community of scholars and thinkers, grew denser, more active, more conscious of itself as a force in European cultural life. In France, the intellectual climate was different from England, more constrained by censorship, more dangerous for those who questioned orthodox religion or criticized absolute monarchy, but perhaps for that very reason, more electric with possibility. Voltaire, still a young man, was already making a name for himself with his wit, his plays, his dangerous tongue that would land him more than once in the Bastille. When he traveled to England in the 1720s, fleeing yet another controversy, he encountered a society that seemed to him freer, more rational, more committed to tolerance and empirical investigation. He absorbed the ideas of Newton and Locke, and when he returned to France, he brought with him a vision of what French society might become if it embraced similar principles. His letters concerning the English nation, published in 1733, held up England as an implicit reproach to French absolutism. Here was a nation with a constitutional monarchy, with religious tolerance, where commerce flourished, where natural philosophy was celebrated. The book was condemned and burned, but it circulated anyway in the underground networks that were becoming increasingly sophisticated at evading censorship. Montesquieu, a French nobleman and magistrate, published The Spirit of the Laws in 1748, a massive comparative study of different forms of government. He argued for the separation of powers, for checks and balances that would prevent tyranny, for laws suited to the climate, history, effort, and character of different peoples. He wrote with the detachment of a natural philosopher, examining political systems the way one might examine geological formations, looking for patterns, for principles, for underlying structures. These works were being read, discussed, debated in salons throughout Paris, in the drawing rooms of aristocratic hostesses who gathered the brightest minds of the age, where a talented writer or philosopher might mix with dukes and foreign ambassadors, where conversation was an art form, and ideas were tested against the sharp intelligence of men and women who had the education and leisure to engage seriously with them. The salons were crucial. They were spaces where the Enlightenment became social, where abstract ideas were refined through conversation, where reputations were made or destroyed by the quality of one's wit and insight, and they were often presided over by women who could not attend universities or join academies, but who exercised considerable influence as patrons, as interlocutors, as arbiters of intellectual fashion. By mid-century, the Enlightenment was no longer a scattered collection of individual achievements. It was becoming a movement, self-conscious, ambitious, increasingly confident that reason could be applied not just to natural philosophy, but to every domain of human life, to politics, to economics, to religion, to social organization, to the very question of what it meant to live well, to create a good society. And nowhere was this ambition more grandly embodied than in the project that Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert launched in 1751, the Encyclopédie, or Rational Dictionary of the Sciences, Arts, and Crafts, an attempt to gather all human knowledge between the covers of a multi-volume reference work, organized according to reason, accessible to any educated person, a monument to the Enlightenment faith that knowledge, once systematized and disseminated, would drive out ignorance, superstition, and tyranny. The first volume appeared, and then another when another, despite opposition from church authorities, despite censorship, despite the withdrawal of d'Alembert, and moments when it seemed the whole project might collapse. Diderot pressed on, and the volumes continued to appear, filled with articles on everything from agriculture to zoology, from political theory to the manufacture of pins, accompanied by detailed engravings showing the tools and techniques of various trades. This was knowledge democratized, or at least made more accessible, the secrets of crafts laid bare, the insights of philosophers made available to merchants and professionals. It was a declaration that all knowledge was worthy of serious attention, that a well-made shoe was as deserving of careful description as a treatise on metaphysics, and implicit in this was a leveling impulse, a suggestion that human worth and dignity did not depend on ancient lineage, but on skill, on reason, on contribution to the common good. The printing presses that produced these volumes worked through the night in workshops that smelled of ink and metal, the pressman pulling each page, the compositors selecting individual pieces of type from their cases, arranging them letter by letter into words, words into lines, lines into pages that would carry Diderot's vision across France and beyond. Each volume was a small act of defiance. Each article that questioned tradition or explained natural phenomena through mechanical causes rather than divine intervention was a challenge to authorities who preferred mystery, who benefited from ignorance, who understood that knowledge, once liberated from the control of church and crown, became unpredictable, dangerous. And yet the subscribers kept coming, nobles and professionals, provincial lawyers and wealthy merchants, people who wanted to participate in this grand project of enlightenment, who wanted their libraries to contain this monument to human reason, even if they never read all 28 volumes of text and 11 volumes of plates. In Scotland, something remarkable was happening. A flowering of intellectual life in Edinburgh and Glasgow that would become known as the Scottish Enlightenment. David Hume, a philosopher of devastating skeptical power, was pushing the empiricism of Locke to radical conclusions. If all knowledge came from experience, from sense impressions, then what could we really know with certainty? His Treatise of Human Nature, published when he was just 28, argued that even our most basic beliefs about causation or about the self, about the external world, could not be rationally justified. We believed the sun would rise tomorrow, not because reason proved it, but because habit and custom made it psychologically impossible to believe otherwise. And as for the self, that sense of continuous identity, Hume could find nothing in experience to support it, only a bundle of perceptions following one another with incomprehensible rapidity. This was too much for many. Hume's skepticism seemed to undermine the very foundations of knowledge and morality. And yet he wrote with such clarity, such good humor, such evident pleasure in demolishing pretension, that his work became central to Enlightenment thought, even for those who disagreed with his conclusions. Adam Smith, Hume's friend and fellow Scot, turned his attention to political economy in 1776. The same year as the American Declaration of Independence, he published The Wealth of Nations, a massive investigation into how commercial societies functioned, how wealth was created, how labor was divided. He described a pin factory where the manufacture of a single pin was divided into 18 distinct operations. One man draws out the wire, another straights it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it at the top for receiving the head. And through this division of labor, 10 men could make upward of 48,000 pins in a day, whereas working individually, each man might not make even one. This was the Enlightenment method applied to economics, careful observation, systematic analysis, looking for the underlying principles that governed human behavior in markets. Smith argued that individuals pursuing their own self-interest, guided by an invisible hand, could produce outcomes beneficial to society as a whole, without anyone intending or planning for such outcomes. It was a vision of spontaneous order, of complex systems arising from simple rules. And while Smith was no naive advocate of unregulated markets, he was deeply concerned with justice and the corrupting influence of monopoly. His work provided a framework for understanding commercial society that would influence thinking for centuries to come. Immanuel Kant, in the Prussian city of Königsberg, lived a life of such regularity that neighbors supposedly set their clocks by his daily walk. And from this ordered existence, he produced philosophy of extraordinary ambition and rigor, attempting to synthesize the rationalism of continental philosophy with the empiricism of the British tradition. His Critique of Pure Reason, published in 1781, argued that while all knowledge begins with experience, not all knowledge arises from experience. The mind itself contributed certain structures, categories of understanding, forms of intuition that made experience possible. We see the world in space and time. We understand it through concepts like causation, not because the world necessarily is that way, but because our minds cannot grasp it otherwise. This was called the Copernican revolution in philosophy. Just as Copernicus had made the earth revolve around the sun, Kant made the objects of knowledge conform to the mind, rather than the mind passively receiving impressions from objects. And on this foundation, he built a moral philosophy centered on the categorical imperative. the principle that one should act only according to maxims that could be willed as universal laws. Kant also wrote about enlightenment itself in a brief essay asking, "What is enlightenment?" His answer became one of the movement's defining statements. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity being the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another, and the motto of enlightenment, sapere aude, dare to know, have courage to use your own understanding. This was both a celebration of human potential and a call to intellectual courage, to think for oneself, to question authority, to emerge from the comfortable darkness of received opinion into the demanding light of reason. Across the Atlantic, in the British colonies that would become the United States, Enlightenment ideas were circulating with particular intensity. Benjamin Franklin, printer and polymath, conducted experiments with electricity, invented practical devices, corresponded with the great minds of Europe, and applied himself to questions of government and civic improvement with the same experimental spirit he brought to natural philosophy. Thomas Jefferson owned one of the finest libraries in America, filled with works by Locke and Montesquieu, by Hume and Adam Smith, by the French philosophe whose company he would enjoy during his years in Paris, when he sat down to draft the Declaration of Independence. The phrases that emerged about self-evident truths, about inalienable rights, about governments deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. These were not his alone. They were the common currency of Enlightenment thought, given particular form and force by the circumstances of revolution. The document itself is a kind of Enlightenment artifact. It begins with general principles, moves to a systematic listing of grievances, builds its case through evidence and reason, and arrives at a conclusion presented as logically necessary. This is how enlightened minds approached problems, whether in natural philosophy or politics. Start with principles, examine evidence, reason to conclusions. In France, the reign of Louis XVI was stumbling toward crisis. The state finances were in chaos. The social structure was increasingly anachronistic. Privilege and rational organization were in conflict everywhere one looked. And the philosophes, the intellectuals and reformers, were articulating ever more pointed critiques of the old regime. Voltaire had become the most famous writer in Europe. His novellas, like Candide, used wit and irony to demolish optimistic philosophies and expose human cruelty and folly. His letters and pamphlets attacked religious intolerance, judicial torture, the persecution of those who thought differently. His cry of "Écrasez l'infâme," crush the infamous thing, became a rallying point for those who saw in the alliance of throne and altar the source of oppression and ignorance. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, always the outlier, the uncomfortable voice that refused to celebrate progress, wrote works that profoundly influenced the Enlightenment while also criticizing some of its core assumptions. His discourse on inequality argued that civilized society had corrupted natural human goodness, that property and social distinction had introduced vice and misery unknown in the state of nature. In The Social Contract, he proposed that legitimate political authority required not just consent, but a more profound union, the creation of a general will, a common good that transcended individual interests. The opening line became famous: "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains, and his solution involved a transformation of individuals into citizens willing the common good as their own. His Emile, a treatise on education disguised as a novel, argued for child-centered learning, for education that developed natural capacities rather than forcing conformity to social conventions. It was a vision of human development that influenced pedagogical thinking for generations, even as the Catholic Church condemned the book and burned it. Rousseau was difficult, prickly, paranoid in his later years. He quarreled with his fellow philosophes, with Hume, with Diderot, and yet his influence was immense, particularly on those who would make the French Revolution, who found in his work a language for popular sovereignty, for the transformation of subjects into citizens, for the creation of a new kind of political community. The Salon of Baron d'Holbach in Paris became a gathering place for the most radical thinkers. Here, atheism was openly discussed, materialism defended, the whole edifice of Christian revelation subjected to withering critique. D'Holbach's System of Nature, published anonymously in 1770, argued that the universe was nothing but matter in motion, that there was no God, no soul, no afterlife, only nature operating according to mechanical laws, and that human beings, properly understanding this, could create morality and meaning without recourse to supernatural sanctions. This was too much for many Enlightenment thinkers. Voltaire himself, no friend of the Church, believed that religion, even if false, was socially necessary, that without fear of divine punishment, the masses would descend into chaos, and he attacked d'Holbach's atheism as irresponsible, dangerous. But the ideas were loose in the world, circulating in clandestine manuscripts, discussed in private gatherings. They represented the most radical edge of Enlightenment thought, the willingness to follow reason wherever it led, even into conclusions that seemed to threaten the very foundations of social order. The Americas provided not just philosophical inspiration, but practical laboratories. The new United States created a government based on Enlightenment principles with a written constitution, separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism. It was an experiment watched closely by reformers across Europe, proof that societies could be deliberately designed according to rational principles, that the old organic theories of state, kingdoms growing like trees over centuries, could be replaced by conscious political architecture. The Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 brought together men steeped in Enlightenment learning. James Madison had studied history and political theory, comparing different forms of government, analyzing the causes of faction and tyranny. The Federalist Papers that he wrote with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay applied this learning to the practical task of persuading New Yorkers to ratify the Constitution, each essay a small masterpiece of political reasoning, marshalling evidence, addressing objections, building cumulative arguments for a new form of Republican government. And yet, even as these practical experiments in enlightened government took shape, even as reason seemed ascendant, other currents were beginning to flow, currents that would eventually challenge the Enlightenment's supreme confidence in rationality, in progress, in the perfectibility of human nature and human institutions. The French Revolution began in 1789 with declarations of rights, with the storming of the Bastille, with celebrations that seemed to vindicate everything the philosophes had written. Here was the old regime crumbling. Here were citizens claiming their natural rights. Here was enlightenment descending from the realm of ideas into the streets and assemblies of an actual nation. The declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen echoed Enlightenment principles in every article. Men are born free and equal in rights. The aim of political association is the preservation of natural rights. Sovereignty resides in the nation. Law is the expression of the general will. It was Locke and Rousseau and Montesquieu rendered into constitutional language. It was the Enlightenment achieving political form. But the revolution did not remain within enlightened bounds. It radicalized, became violent. The September massacres of 1792 saw over 1,000 prisoners killed by mobs. The terror that followed sent thousands to the guillotine, including many who had welcomed the revolution's beginning, including eventually the revolutionaries themselves, devouring their own in spirals of suspicion and ideological purity. Maximilien Robespierre, a man who had absorbed Rousseau's writings, who spoke the language of virtue and the general will, presided over mass executions in the name of revolutionary justice. The goddess Reason was installed in Notre Dame Cathedral. A new calendar was proclaimed, erasing Christian chronology, declaring year one of the Republic, attempting to remake time itself according to rational principles. This was the Enlightenment pushed to a kind of terrible logical extreme. If reason could question everything, if tradition had no authority, if society could be remade according to rational design, then why stop at political reform? Why not reconstruct human nature itself? Eliminate all those who stood in the way of the rational society. Edmund Burke, watching from England, wrote his Reflections on the Revolution in France. A powerful conservative critique that argued the revolutionaries had forgotten that human beings were not blank slates, that societies were organic growths, embodying the accumulated wisdom of generations, that abstract reason, untethered from tradition and custom, led not to liberation but to tyranny. The revolution revealed something the more optimistic Enlightenment thinkers had not fully grasped, that reason could be a tool of oppression as easily as liberation, that the destruction of old structures could unleash chaos rather than ushering in a rational order, that human nature was perhaps darker and more complex than the philosophe had imagined. Immanuel Kant, still in his orderly Königsberg, watched these events with a mixture of hope and alarm. He never renounced his belief in enlightenment, in progress, in the possibility of perpetual peace through republican government and international federation. But he understood that enlightenment was a process, not an event, that humanity's emergence from immaturity would be gradual, uneven, subject to reversals. In 1795, he published Perpetual Peace, imagining a world federation of republican states, bound by international law, where war would become obsolete. It was a vision born of enlightened optimism, and yet written in the shadow of European wars that would continue for another 2 decades. Napoleon Bonaparte emerged from the revolutionary chaos, a military genius who crowned himself emperor, who spread revolutionary principles across Europe at the point of a bayonet, who rationalized legal codes, abolished feudal privileges, promoted careers open to talent, but who also established a new despotism, censored the press, crowned himself in a ceremony that deliberately evoked the sacred kingship the revolution had overthrown. The Napoleonic Code was in many ways an Enlightenment achievement, systematic, rational, treating all citizens equally before the law, eliminating the patchwork of local customs and privileges that had characterized the old regime, and yet it was imposed by military conquest, enforced by an authoritarian state, a reminder that enlightened reforms did not necessarily require or produce political freedom. In the German states, a new movement was stirring, Romanticism, which began as a literary and artistic rebellion against what its proponents saw as the cold rationalism of the Enlightenment. The Romantics celebrated emotion over reason, imagination over analysis, the particular over the universal, the organic over the mechanical. Johann Gottfried Herder argued that each culture, each folk, had its own unique spirit, its own language and customs that could not be judged by abstract universal standards. This was a direct challenge to the Enlightenment cosmopolitanism that saw human nature as everywhere the same, reason as a universal solvent that would dissolve local prejudices and superstitions. The poets of the Romantic movement, Wordsworth and Coleridge in England, Goethe and Schiller in Germany, created works that elevated individual feeling and direct experience of nature over scientific analysis. They saw in the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason a kind of death, a mechanical philosophy that drained the world of mystery and meaning, that reduced a beauty to proportion, wonder to explanation. And yet this too was in some ways the Enlightenment's child. The emphasis on individual experience, on authenticity, on questioning received wisdom, these were Enlightenment moves turned in new directions. Rousseau had already pointed the way with his celebration of natural feeling over artificial social conventions. The Romantics followed that path away from rationalism towards something more intuitive, more emotional, more attuned to what could not be measured or systematized. The late 18th and early 19th centuries saw Enlightenment ideas spreading globally, but always transformed by local contexts in Latin America. Creole elites read the philosophes and the North American founding fathers and drew from them justifications for independence from Spanish colonial rule. Simón Bolívar led revolutions inspired by Enlightenment republicanism, though the resulting nations struggled to realize those ideals in societies deeply divided by race and class. In Russia, Catherine the Great corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot, invited philosophes to her court, proclaimed herself an enlightened despot who would modernize Russia through rational reforms, yet she remained an autocrat. And when the French Revolution revealed where Enlightenment ideas might lead, she drew back, censored dangerous books, persecuted those who pushed too hard for change. The Enlightenment had always contained tensions between reason and experience, between individual rights and social utility, between skepticism and the need for foundations, between cosmopolitan universalism and particular attachments, between faith in progress and awareness of human limitations. Some Enlightenment thinkers had been optimists, believing in the perfectibility of human nature, in the inevitable triumph of reason over superstition, in progress as a kind of natural law. Condorcet, even as he hid from the terror that would eventually kill him, wrote his sketch for a historical picture of the progress of the human mind, tracing humanity's advance through 10 stages, culminating in a future of indefinite improvement through the application of science and reason. Others were more skeptical. Hume had questioned whether reason could establish any solid foundations whether moral judgments were anything more than expressions of sentiment. Voltaire's wit often had a dark edge. His candid, mocking, easy optimism, showing a world full of suffering that no philosophical system could explain away or justify. By the early decades of the 1800s, the Enlightenment as a coherent movement was fading, fragmenting into successor movements that accepted some of its premises while rejecting others. Liberalism embraced individual rights and constitutional government, but often backed away from democracy. Socialism accepted the possibility of rational social organization, but rejected market economics. Romanticism celebrated individual genius, but turned away from universal reason toward particular cultures and traditions. The scientific revolution that had helped inspire the Enlightenment continued, accelerated even new discoveries in chemistry, in biology, in electricity and magnetism. The Industrial Revolution transformed economies and societies with a thoroughness the philosophe could scarcely have imagined. Steam engines and factories, railroads and telegraphs, cities swelling with workers, new forms of wealth and new forms of poverty. Mary Wollstonecraft had written A Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792, applying Enlightenment principles to the situation of women, arguing that if reason was the defining human characteristic, if education shaped character, then women's apparent inferiority was the result of denied education and opportunities, not natural incapacity. It was a radical extension of Enlightenment logic, one that most male philosophes had not pursued, but it planted seeds that would grow into movements for women's rights and suffrage. The abolition movement, too, drew on Enlightenment ideas. The Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade was founded in 1787, bringing together Quakers and other reformers who argued that slavery violated natural rights, contradicted Christian teaching, and debased both enslaved and enslaver. The campaign used Enlightenment methods, gathering evidence, publishing testimonies, making systematic arguments based on moral principles and economic analysis. And yet the Enlightenment had also been compatible with slavery. Jefferson owned enslaved people, even as he wrote that all men are created equal. Hume made racist comments about the intellectual capacities of Africans. Many philosophes invested in or benefited from colonial trade built on enslaved labor. The universalism of Enlightenment rhetoric often stopped at the boundaries of race and empire. This tension between universal principles and particular exclusions would become one of the Enlightenment's most contested legacies. Were its ideals genuinely universal, applicable to all human beings? Or were they, from the beginning, marked by the limitations of their European, male, propertied origins? The answers to such questions were not settled in the age itself. They became part of ongoing arguments, struggles, movements that extended across the 19th and 20th centuries. As different groups claimed Enlightenment principles for their own emancipation, expanded the circle of who counted as fully human, fully entitled to rights and dignity. The Enlightenment had been many things, a philosophical movement and a social phenomenon, a celebration of reason and a method of critique, a liberation from traditional authority and the creation of new forms of power. It had produced magnificent achievements in science and philosophy, inspired revolutions and reforms, and also revealed the dangers of reason untethered from wisdom, of certainty without humility, of progress without understanding its costs. As the 19th century unfolded, The world the Enlightenment had helped create became more complex, more industrialized, more democratic in some ways, more brutally hierarchical in others. The easy confidence that reason and science would inevitably improve the human condition gave way to more ambivalent assessments, more awareness of what had been lost as well as gained, more questions about whether the modern world the Enlightenment had ushered in was truly more enlightened, and yet returning to that imagined library, the one where this journey began, I find myself thinking not about what the Enlightenment achieved or failed to achieve, but about the quality of mind it represented, the particular kind of courage it took to question everything, to trust in human reason when all of history seemed to counsel humility before mystery. There is something almost vertigo-inducing in the Enlightenment stance, the willingness to stand without the supports that had sustained human societies for millennia, without divine revelation as the foundation of morality, without tradition as the justification for authority, without the comfort of believing that the universe was designed for human benefit. That suffering had cosmic meaning. The philosophers looked into that void and did not flinch, or rather, they flinched but continued anyway. They proposed that human beings could create meaning, could establish justice, could pursue happiness, not because gods commanded it or nature intended it, but because reason revealed it as worthy, as conducive to human flourishing. This was a tremendous burden to place on reason, perhaps an impossible one, and the history that followed showed both what such confidence could achieve and where it could lead astray, but there remains something magnificent in the attempt, in the sheer audacity of believing that the human mind, properly employed, could understand the world and improve the human condition. Consider what it meant to live through that transformation, to grow up in a world where authority was unquestioned, where the social order seemed fixed by divine decree, and then to encounter ideas that suggested everything could be otherwise, that kings ruled by consent rather than divine right, that the church's teachings could be examined and found wanting, that nature operated by laws discoverable through experiment rather than inscrutable providence. For some, this must have been terrifying, the ground giving way beneath their feet, all certainties dissolving. For others, it must have been exhilarating, liberating, the sense that human beings were no longer bound by the past, that the future was open, malleable, subject to conscious design, the coffee houses and salons, the printing presses and postal networks. These were not just mechanisms for spreading ideas. They were creating a new kind of social space, a public sphere where private individuals could engage with matters of common concern, where arguments could be advanced and contested on their merits rather than on the basis of who made them. This too was revolutionary, the notion that truth was not handed down from above, but emerged through discussion, through the clash of perspectives, through the refinement of ideas in the furnace of debate. It assumed a kind of equality among participants, at least in principle, that what mattered was the force of one's arguments rather than one's birth or position. Of course, the reality never quite matched this ideal. Women were largely excluded from formal intellectual life, though the salons gave some aristocratic women considerable influence. The laboring poor had neither the education nor the leisure to participate. Colonial subjects were not considered part of the conversation at all, except as objects of study or targets of improvement. And yet, the principles, once articulated, had a way of escaping the boundaries their originators intended. If all men are created equal, why only men? If reason is the human birthright, why should education be denied to the poor? If natural rights inhere in all human beings, what justifies the enslavement of Africans or the conquest of indigenous peoples? These questions did not go away. They became the basis for struggles that extended far beyond the 18th century. The Enlightenment planted seeds that would flower in abolition movements and women's suffrage, in anti-colonial nationalism and civil rights, in ongoing arguments about who belongs to the community of equals, who deserves dignity and respect and a voice in their own governance. The tension between the Enlightenment's universalist rhetoric and its particularist practice remains one of its most productive contradictions. It gave oppressed groups a language to articulate their demands, principles to hold the powerful accountable, even as those principles had originally been formulated in ways that excluded them. There is something else worth contemplating in the quiet of this library: the Enlightenment faith in progress, the belief that history had a direction, that humanity was moving, however haltingly, toward greater knowledge, to greater freedom, greater happiness. This was not simply naive optimism. It was based on evidence, on the genuine achievements of science and philosophy, on political reforms that expanded rights and reduced arbitrary power. But it also contained a kind of hubris, an assumption that Western European civilization represented the pinnacle of human development, that other cultures were simply earlier stages on the same path, waiting to be enlightened, civilized, improved. This justified colonialism, missionary work, the imposition of European norms and institutions on societies that had their own rich traditions and ways of organizing collective life. The costs of this civilizing mission were immense. Cultures destroyed, languages lost, peoples subjugated and exploited, all in the name of progress, of bringing light to darkness, of replacing superstition with reason. The Enlightenment's best impulses were thus entangled with some of modernity's worst crimes, and untangling them remains difficult, necessary work. Walking through this library in my imagination, running fingers along the spines of these volumes, I am aware of holding multiple truths simultaneously, that the Enlightenment produced works of extraordinary insight and beauty, and that it enabled new forms of violence and domination, that its emphasis on reason and evidence remains essential, and that reason alone is not enough, that its universalist aspirations were genuine and worthy, and that they were compromised from the beginning by exclusions and hierarchies. Perhaps this is itself an Enlightenment move, the willingness to hold complexity, to resist simple judgments, to acknowledge both achievement and failure, to learn from the past without either romanticizing or dismissing it. The light in the library is almost gone now. The windows are dark, and the few candles I imagine burning cast more shadow than illumination. And this seems appropriate, because the Enlightenment's legacy is not simply light, but a particular quality of twilight, where we can see some things clearly, while others remain obscure, where we must navigate by partial knowledge, aware of how much we do not and cannot know. The philosophes believed that more light was always better, that darkness was the enemy, that mystery was simply ignorance waiting to be dispelled, and they were right about much. Their insistence on evidence over authority, on reason over revelation, on human dignity and rights, these remain vital commitments worthy of defense and extension. But perhaps they did not fully appreciate what the Romantics understood, that some truths are poetic rather than propositional, that mystery is not always ignorance, but sometimes the appropriate response to complexity. That reason is one human capacity among others, valuable but not all sufficient, needing to be balanced by emotion, imagination, tradition, solidarity, care, the candles burn lower, wax pooling, flames wavering in currents of air, too subtle to feel. And I think of all those other candles in all those other rooms across centuries now passed into history, each one a small defiance of darkness, each one illuminating a page, a face, a conversation that contributed in some way to the slow, uneven, incomplete emergence of humanity from what Kant called its self-imposed immaturity. That emergence continues. We are still working out the implications of Enlightenment ideas, still struggling with the tensions they contain, still trying to realize their best promises while avoiding their worst pitfalls, still learning to use reason critically, including critical reason applied to reason itself, to its limits and blind spots and potential for misuse. The Enlightenment was never a destination. It was a way of traveling, a commitment to questioning, to evidence, to the difficult work of thinking for oneself, and that work does not end, cannot end, because each generation inherits problems the previous generation could not solve, encounters challenges that require new applications of old principles, or sometimes new principles entirely. In this quiet room, surrounded by the accumulated thought of that remarkable century, I feel a kind of gratitude for the courage of those who questioned, who risked persecution and ridicule, who imagined societies more just and rational than any that had existed, who believed that human beings deserved better than ignorance and superstition and arbitrary power. And I feel, too, a kind of responsibility to carry forward what was best in their project, to correct what was limited or wrong, to apply their critical method to their own assumptions, to extend the circle of concern and dignity they sometimes drew too narrowly, to remember that enlightenment is not possession but process, not arrival but journey. The flames are very low now, barely more than glowing embers, the room settling into darkness, and outside I can imagine stars becoming visible, distant suns burning in a universe vast and ancient, indifferent to human concerns, and yet somehow made meaningful by the human minds that contemplate them, that measure their distances and compositions, that find in their wheeling patterns evidence of natural law, of a cosmos that can be understood, at least partially, at least enough to inspire wonder and humility both. This is where the Enlightenment leaves us, between knowledge and mystery, between what we can grasp and what exceeds our grasp, between the light of reason and the darkness that remains, and perhaps will always remain beyond its reach. And in this twilight space, this threshold between knowing and unknowing, we continue the work of thinking, questioning, seeking, not because we believe we will achieve perfect knowledge or create perfect societies, but because this is what it means to be human, to use the capacities we have, imperfect as they are, to make sense of our world and our place in it, to create meaning and justice where none is given, to be the light we need, however dim, however flickering, however insufficient, in a universe that offers no other. The last candle gutters and goes out, and the library settles into complete darkness. But somehow this is not an ending. It is simply a pause, a rest before dawn, before someone else enters this room or one like it, opens a volume, begins to read, begins again the endless conversation about what it means to live well, to think clearly, to treat one another with dignity, to emerge gradually, imperfectly, from darkness into such light as we can make.